Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. This story begins with me, a regular guy who's always had a soft spot for the outdoors. My name is Adam, and I've spent countless weekends trekking through trails, chasing sunsets, and losing myself in the calm of nature. The woods have always been a place where I feel at peace. This particular trip, though, was supposed to be a quick escape from the pressures of my day-to-day life. I remember it so vividly, and not for the reasons you might expect. It was early fall, the kind of season where the leaves are just starting to change, painting the trees in a spectrum of fiery reds and golds. The air was crisp, with that earthy scent you only get in the woods. I'd been itching for a weekend off, so I packed my gear, a sturdy tent, some canned food, a flashlight, my trusted compass, and a good old map. No GPS, no phone distractions, just me in the wild. The plan was simple: a 2-day hike through the isolated trails of Pine Hollow Forest, about a 2-hour drive from my small suburban town. Pine Hollow was famous for its untouched beauty, its towering pines stretching endlessly into the sky. I'd hiked here before, but this time I wanted to explore a less traveled path, something more secluded, away from the regular campers. Before heading out, I stopped at a tiny gas station at the edge of the forest to fill up my tank. The place was barely more than a shack, with a faded sign that simply read, "Gas and Goods." The guy behind the counter was an older man with silver hair and a lined face that spoke of years spent under the sun. He nodded at me as I paid for a bottle of water. "Heading into the woods, huh?" he asked in a voice that sounded like gravel crunching underfoot. I nodded. "Yeah, just for the weekend. Got a route planned and everything." His eyes narrowed slightly, and he seemed to hesitate before speaking again. "Stick to the main trails. Some parts of that forest aren't kind to wanderers." I chuckled, brushing off his warning. "Don't worry, I'm good with a map. Been hiking for years." He didn't smile back. "Maps don't always tell you what's out there," he said quietly, and that was the end of the conversation. Brushing it off, I drove to the trailhead, ready for what I thought would be a peaceful weekend. I parked my car in the small dirt lot, shouldered my backpack, and started down the trail. The woods were stunning, just as I'd hoped. The sunlight filtered through the trees, creating shifting patterns on the ground. Birds chirped overhead, and the occasional rustle of leaves signaled squirrels darting about their business. The first few hours were perfect. I followed the main trail, stopping occasionally to snap photos or take a sip of water. By midday, I found a clearing with a view of the valley below. It was breathtaking, the kind of view that makes you forget about the chaos of daily life. I sat there for a while, eating a sandwich and enjoying the silence. As the afternoon wore on, I decided to veer off the main path. I wasn't looking for trouble, just a little adventure. The lesser-used trail I'd marked on my map seemed like a great idea at the time. It was narrower, overgrown in places, but still easy enough to follow. I'd told myself I'd only explore it for an hour or two before doubling back to set up camp near the main trail. The solitude out there was different. It wasn't like the comforting quiet of the main trail. This was deeper, heavier. The only sounds were my boots crunching against the dirt and the occasional call of a crow. I remember thinking how odd it was not to hear more wildlife. No deer darting through the brush, no chirping insects, just silence. After about an hour, I came across a peculiar sight, a rusted metal sign nailed to a tree. It was faded, with letters I could barely make out. It looked like it once read something like "Keep Out" or "No Trespassing." Strange, but not enough to deter me. I figured it was old, probably leftover from when this part of the forest might have been private land. I kept going, deeper into the woods, the trees growing denser around me. By the time I decided to turn back, the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky. I pulled out my compass and checked my map. Everything seemed fine. I retraced my steps, or so I thought, but after about 15 minutes, nothing looked familiar. The trees all seemed off, like they were leaning closer together. The air felt cooler, and the sky was darker than it should have been for that time of day. I stopped walking, listening intently. That's when I realized how still everything was. No wind rustling the leaves, no birdsong, just an oppressive, unnatural quiet. My chest tightened as I looked around, realizing I might have strayed farther than I thought. But I wasn't worried, not yet. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of this part of the forest. I'd find my way back soon enough. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. As the eerie stillness of the forest enveloped me, I pressed on, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. I reminded myself I was a seasoned hiker. I'd been off trail before. All I had to do was stay calm, trust my compass, and retrace my steps. But the deeper I went, the harder it became to convince myself everything was fine. About 20 minutes into my attempt to backtrack, I noticed something odd. The trees around me, tall pines that had earlier stretched straight and proud, seemed different. Their trunks appeared twisted, gnarled in ways that looked unnatural. Their bark was darker, almost charred in places, though there had been no signs of fire in the area. The further I walked, the more prominent these changes became, as if I'd wandered into an entirely different part of the woods without realizing it. Then I saw the first truly strange thing, a pile of rocks stacked neatly in a small clearing. There were 5 or 6 stones, each progressively smaller, forming a near-perfect cone. It was deliberate, precise, and completely out of place. At first, I thought it might have been left by another hiker, perhaps as a marker. But there were no signs of recent activity, no footprints, no trampled grass. The area around the stones was pristine. I crouched to get a closer look. The rocks weren't ordinary. Their surfaces were smooth and glossy, like river stones, but they were dry to the touch and cold. Unusually cold. A chill ran through me as I held one, a sensation that had nothing to do with the cool air. I set it back down and stood, brushing off the feeling. Strange, sure, but nothing sinister. At least, that's what I told myself. As I moved on, I became hyper-aware of my surroundings. Every rustle of leaves or creak of branches seemed amplified. At one point, I paused to take another look at my map, but my fingers fumbled with the paper, the anxiety making them clumsy. My compass was still pointing north, but something felt wrong. I checked the map again and again, but no matter how much I tried to orient myself, I couldn't match my position to any landmarks. That's when I heard a sound that didn't belong. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, like a whisper carried on the wind. I froze, straining to listen. It came again, louder this time. A low, rhythmic thumping, like the beating of a drum. It seemed to echo through the trees, distant yet close enough to make my pulse quicken. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. There was nothing. Just trees and shadows, stretching endlessly in every direction. The sound faded as quickly as it had come, leaving behind an even heavier silence. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a woodpecker, though it didn't quite sound like one. Or perhaps it was something falling a branch, a distant tree. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. As I continued walking, the strange occurrences began to stack up. A few minutes later, I came across another peculiar sight, a single shoe lying in the middle of the path. It was an old hiking boot, caked in mud and moss, its laces frayed and undone. There were no other signs of its owner, no second boot, no footprints leading to or from it. The sight of it stopped me in my tracks. I stood there, staring at the boot, my mind racing. Who had left it here, and why? Had someone lost it, or had they left it intentionally? And why was it so far off the main trail? A creeping unease settled over me as I realized the boot looked ancient, as though it had been there for decades, despite being in relatively good shape. I decided not to touch it. Instead, I skirted around it and pressed on, picking up my pace. By now, the sky was darkening, the light filtering through the trees growing dimmer with every passing minute. I knew I had to find a suitable spot to set up camp soon. The thought of spending the night out here was unsettling, but I couldn't risk wandering aimlessly in the dark. Just as I was beginning to scout for a clearing, I heard it again, that low, rhythmic thumping. This time, it was louder and more distinct, and it sent a jolt of fear through me. It wasn't random, it was deliberate, like the beating of a massive drum. The sound seemed to come from all around me, reverberating through the trees. I stopped, gripping my compass tightly, my heart hammering in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. It felt foolish, but the silence was unbearable. There was no response. The thumping stopped abruptly, leaving behind an emptiness that was almost worse. The forest seemed to hold its breath, as though it was waiting for something. I tried to focus on finding a spot to camp, but every shadow seemed to loom larger, every sound seemed sharper. My flashlight's beam flickered as I searched the ground for a flat patch of earth. When I finally found a small clearing, I worked quickly, setting up my tent with trembling hands. Once inside, I zipped the flap shut and sat cross-legged on my sleeping bag, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. I told myself I was safe, that the tent was a barrier between me and whatever was out there. But the thin fabric felt flimsy, barely enough to keep out the chill, let alone anything else. As I sat there, trying to calm my breathing, I heard it again. Not the drum-like thumping this time, but something else, a faint, scratching sound. It came from somewhere outside the tent, slow and deliberate, as though someone or something was dragging their fingers across the fabric. My blood ran cold. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. The scratching stopped, then started again, closer this time. I shone my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam only illuminated the inside of the tent, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. I couldn't take it anymore. I burst out of the tent, flashlight in hand, and swung the beam wildly around the clearing. There was nothing there. No animals, no people. Just the trees and the oppressive darkness. The air was colder now, biting against my skin. I stood there for a long time, my flashlight trembling in my grip, before retreating back into the tent. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear faint noises, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, distant whispers. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted, but at least the light brought some sense of security. I packed up my things quickly, determined to find my way back to the main trail. But as I prepared to leave the clearing, I saw something that made my stomach drop, a second stack of rocks, identical to the first, placed right outside my tent. I didn't put it there. The moment I saw the second stack of rocks outside my tent, a cold weight settled in my stomach. My first instinct was to dismiss it, to think maybe I hadn't noticed it when I arrived, though deep down, I knew better. It wasn't there last night. Someone or something had placed it there while I sat trembling in my tent. I told myself not to panic. The woods were vast, and it wasn't impossible for another hiker to have passed through. But the thought of someone creeping into my camp, silently stacking stones while I was just feet away, made my skin crawl. I needed to move, to put distance between myself and this unsettling place. As I began hiking again, I noticed the forest felt heavier, almost oppressive. The air, damp and cold, seemed to cling to me. The sunlight filtering through the trees was muted, as though a veil had been cast over the forest. The usual chirps of birds and rustling leaves were replaced by an eerie stillness, broken only by the occasional snapping of twigs beneath my boots. The unease I felt was quickly compounded by something I couldn't ignore. No matter which direction I turned, I kept seeing signs of those strange stacks of stones. Some were off the path, hidden among thick undergrowth, while others were in plain sight, as if left intentionally to guide or warn me. Each one seemed colder than the last, their glossy surfaces reflecting light in unnatural ways. I stopped at one particularly intricate stack, the stones balanced precariously in a way that defied gravity. Something about it felt deliberate, almost mocking. Kneeling down, I hesitated before touching the rocks. They were ice cold, even though the sun was shining faintly above. My fingers lingered just long enough to notice something strange. The stones felt almost alive, vibrating faintly as if reacting to my presence. I yanked my hand back, my heart racing. Pushing forward, I began marking my path on the map to ensure I wasn't walking in circles. Yet, no matter how far I trekked, I kept coming across the same landmarks, the gnarled trees, the peculiar clearings, the stacks of rocks. It was as if the forest itself was conspiring to trap me within its depths. And then I found the carving. It was etched into the bark of an ancient tree, the grooves deep and jagged, as though made by a crude, unsteady hand. The symbol was unfamiliar, a series of interlocking triangles, surrounded by what looked like runes or letters in a language I couldn't identify. The sight of it filled me with a strange sense of dread. I reached out to trace the lines, but as my fingers brushed the bark, I heard something a faint whisper, almost imperceptible. I spun around, scanning the woods. The whispering grew louder, though it didn't come from any one direction. It was as if the forest itself was murmuring, the sound rising and falling like the tide. The words, or what I thought were words, were garbled, just on the edge of comprehension. My pulse quickened, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over an exposed root. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the laughter. It started faint and distant, like the chuckle of a child. It echoed through the trees, growing louder and more distorted, as though several voices were overlapping in a macabre harmony. The sound sent a chill down my spine, and I bolted. I ran without direction, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Branches tore at my clothes, and my legs burned from exertion, but I didn't dare stop. The laughter seemed to follow me, always just out of sight. When I finally slowed, gasping for air, I realized I was completely lost. My map was useless now, nothing around me matched the terrain it depicted. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were faint at first, pressed into the damp soil bare, human-like prints that didn't belong to me. They were too small, too narrow, and they moved erratically, weaving in and out of my path. Following them with my eyes, I saw they led toward another tree with carvings. This time, the symbol was different, a circle with a single jagged line cutting through it. Around the base of the tree were more stones, arranged in a perfect circle. The center of the circle was scorched, as if by fire, though there were no ashes or signs of recent activity. I couldn't ignore it anymore. These weren't random coincidences or the remnants of some forgotten camping trip. Someone or something was out here with me. Driven by equal parts fear and curiosity, I decided to investigate further. I marked the spot on my map, though the act felt almost futile now. As I studied the carvings, I noticed something strange. The air around the tree was warmer, almost stifling, despite the cold of the forest. The heat was oppressive, making it hard to breathe. I backed away, my instincts screaming at me to leave. As I turned to continue my search for the main trail, I heard it again, the rhythmic thumping. Only this time, it was louder and accompanied by a new sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground. My legs felt like lead as I forced myself to move, scanning my surroundings for the source of the noise. The growl grew louder, more insistent, and I realized with a sickening certainty that it was coming from above. Slowly, I tilted my head upward. There, perched high in the branches of a gnarled tree, was a figure. It was difficult to make out in the dappled light, but it didn't move like any animal I'd ever seen. Its limbs were too long, its posture too rigid, and its eyes, those eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. The figure tilted its head, observing me with an unnatural stillness. Then, with a sudden, jarring motion, it leapt from the tree, landing with an inhuman grace just beyond the edge of my vision. The growling stopped, replaced by an unnerving silence. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I ran, my lungs burning, my mind racing with every worst-case scenario imaginable. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees becoming a labyrinth designed to trap me. After what felt like hours, I stumbled into another clearing. This one was larger, with a single object standing at its center, a wooden totem, carved with the same strange symbols I'd seen earlier. Around it were more footprints, more stone stacks, and what looked like fragments of clothing, tattered and weathered by time. I didn't dare approach. Instead, I circled the clearing, searching for any sign of a trail. The forest was darker now, the light almost entirely gone, though it was still early evening. It felt as though the day itself was being swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. And then I heard it, a voice. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but it grew louder with every passing second. It wasn't calling my name, at least. I didn't think it was, but the cadence was hauntingly familiar, like an old friend speaking just out of reach. I turned, scanning the trees, but there was no one there. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the stillness. The voice stopped. Then, from somewhere deep in the woods, I heard the laughter again. This time, it was closer. The air was impossibly still as I stood at the edge of the clearing, heart pounding in my chest. The laughter that had haunted me was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to devour every sound. Every instinct told me to turn back, to leave the cursed forest behind, but something in the clearing's center held me captive. It was the totem. Roughly carved and weathered by time, the wooden structure stood nearly 10 feet tall, its surface etched with the symbols I'd seen throughout my journey. This time, the carvings were deeper, more intricate, and disturbingly precise. Spirals wove into jagged lines, creating shapes that seemed to twist and shift when I looked at them for too long. At the top of the totem, a grotesque face was carved, a gaping mouth, hollow eyes, and elongated features that seemed almost lifelike. It was then that I noticed the smell. A foul, metallic stench filled the air, burning my nostrils and turning my stomach. It emanated from the base of the totem, where the ground was dark and damp with a substance I couldn't identify. Something primal stirred within me, a deep, instinctive fear that screamed danger. And then the voice returned. This time, it was clearer, louder, and undeniably close. It wasn't a single voice, but many, overlapping and echoing, as though a crowd had gathered just beyond the clearing. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, their words sharp and guttural, laced with a cadence that felt like chanting. The sound sent shivers down my spine, and I clutched my chest, trying to steady my breathing. I wasn't alone. From the corner of my eye, I caught movement. Turning sharply, I saw them, figures emerging from the shadows of the trees, their forms distorted and wrong. They were humanoid, but their limbs were too long, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their faces were obscured by the darkness, but their eyes glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire. They didn't approach immediately. Instead, they circled the clearing, their movements deliberate and synchronized, as though part of a ritual. My legs trembled, rooted to the spot by a paralyzing mix of fear and disbelief. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice cracking. The figures didn't stop. Their chanting grew louder, reverberating through the clearing and mingling with the oppressive silence. My head throbbed, the sound burrowing into my mind like a relentless tide. Desperate for anything to defend myself, I grabbed a branch from the ground. It was flimsy, barely more than a twig, but it gave me a fleeting sense of control. That's when I saw it. The totem's carved face began to change. Its hollow eyes seemed to follow me, its gaping mouth widening as if to consume me whole. The symbols carved into its surface began to glow, faintly at first, then brighter with each passing moment. The light was unnatural, a sickly green way that pulsed in rhythm with the chanting. I stumbled backward, my eyes darting between the totem and the encroaching figures. They were closer now, their forms clearer in the eerie glow. Their skin, or what I thought was skin, was mottled and translucent, revealing veins that pulsed with the same green light. "Leave me alone," I screamed, swinging the branch wildly. The nearest figure stopped, tilting its head as if studying me. Then, without warning, it let out a piercing shriek, a sound so high-pitched and unearthly that it felt like needles stabbing into my ears. I fell to my knees, clutching my head as the shriek was joined by others, creating a cacophony of terror. The ground beneath me began to vibrate, a low rumble that grew stronger with each passing second. Looking up, I saw the totem glowing brighter, its light illuminating the entire clearing. The chanting reached a fever pitch, and the figures began to converge on me, their movements faster, more erratic. Panic overtook me. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing for an escape. The forest was dense, the trees towering like prison bars, but I had no choice. I ran. The chanting didn't stop. It followed me, echoing through the woods as if the forest itself was alive. The figures were relentless, their glowing eyes visible in my periphery, no matter how fast I ran. I tripped over a root, falling hard onto the forest floor. My hands scraped against the rough earth, but I didn't care. I forced myself up, adrenaline coursing through me. That's when I realized the chanting had stopped. The silence was deafening. I turned slowly, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The figures were gone. The forest was still, eerily so, as if frozen in time. But the totem's glow was still visible, a distant beacon pulsing faintly through the trees. I thought I was safe until I heard the growl. It was low, guttural, and filled with malice. Slowly, I turned my head. Standing just feet away was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen. Its body was massive, hunched and sinewy, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its face was a grotesque blend of human and beast, its eyes glowing with the same sickly green light. Its mouth curled into a snarl, revealing rows of jagged teeth that glistened in the faint glow. My blood ran cold. The creature lunged. I barely had time to react, diving to the side as it crashed into the spot where I'd been standing. The ground shook beneath its weight, and I scrambled backward, the branch still clutched in my trembling hand. It charged again, faster than anything its size should have been capable of. I swung the branch wildly, the wood cracking against its thick hide. It barely flinched, its glowing eyes locked onto mine. Desperation took over. I threw the branch aside and ran, zigzagging through the trees in a frantic bid to escape. The creature was relentless, crashing through the undergrowth with a feral roar. I spotted a large tree ahead, its roots forming a natural alcove. Diving into the space, I pressed myself against the trunk, holding my breath as the creature stormed past. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the chanting returned. It was louder now, deafening in its intensity. The ground began to tremble, and I realized the glow wasn't coming from the totem anymore. It was coming from the forest itself. The trees, the rocks, even the air seemed to pulse with that unnatural light. I knew I couldn't stay hidden. Emerging from the alcove, I ran toward the only direction that didn't seem to pulse with light. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I couldn't stop. The chanting was everywhere, the figures appearing and disappearing like shadows in the corners of my vision. I burst into another clearing, this one empty except for a small pool of water at its center. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the glowing forest around it. Collapsing at the edge, I peered into the pool. My reflection stared back at me, pale and terrified, but something was wrong. My eyes! They glowed faintly green. I screamed, falling backward. The chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by the creature's guttural growl. It was there, standing on the other side of the pool, its glowing eyes locked onto mine. The forest seemed to close in around us, the glowing light intensifying. I didn't know if I was going to survive, but I wasn't going to give up without a fight. Taking a deep breath, I stood my ground. The forest was still again, but it was not the tranquil stillness I had known before entering this cursed place. It was a vacuum, a deafening absence of life, sound, and any sense of normalcy. My chest heaved as I stood at the edge of the pool, heart racing, every nerve on fire. The creature on the other side of the water mirrored my motion, its glowing eyes boring into mine as if daring me to act. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The oppressive glow of the forest dimmed slightly, and the chanting that had plagued me receded into a low hum, vibrating in my bones, but no longer deafening. I didn't know whether it was a reprieve or a prelude to something worse, but I wasn't about to wait and find out. Adrenaline surged through me, and I turned to run, but my feet would move. It was as though the ground itself had come alive, roots twisting around my ankles and holding me in place. The creature began to move, slow and deliberate, stepping closer to the edge of the pool. "No!" I shouted, struggling against the roots. My voice felt small, swallowed by the enormity of the moment. The creature stopped, tilting its grotesque head as if considering my resistance. Then it knelt, dipping a clawed hand into the pool. The water rippled outward in perfect, concentric circles, and as the ripples touched the edges, the forest began to tremble. This wasn't just about me. Whatever this was, it was waking up. I yanked at the roots with all my strength, finally breaking free. I stumbled backward, my arms flailing for balance, and grabbed a sharp stone from the ground. It wasn't much, but it was something. "You don't get to win," I yelled, more to myself than the creature. I hurled the stone at its head. It struck with a sickening thud, and the creature let out a guttural roar, its glowing eyes flaring brighter. For a brief moment, I thought I'd angered it beyond reason, but then it recoiled, stumbling back from the pool. The light in the forest flickered, shadows stretching unnaturally long as the creature writhed in pain. The chanting grew louder again, but this time it wasn't coming from the forest. It was coming from the totem. I turned and saw it in the distance, its grotesque face illuminated in pulsating green. The symbols carved into its surface seemed to dance, shifting into patterns I couldn't comprehend, but felt deep in my gut. It was as though the totem was alive, feeding on the chaos around it. The creature was no longer focused on me. Instead, it turned toward the totem, letting out a series of guttural growls that sounded almost like words. My breath caught in my throat. Was it communicating with the totem? The ground began to quake, and the roots that had ensnared me moments ago started writhing like serpents. I had no choice but to run, sprinting toward the totem. I didn't have a plan, but I knew that the totem was the heart of this nightmare. If I could destroy it, maybe, just maybe, I could end this. The closer I got, the harder it was to move. The air around the totem was thick, almost viscous, and every step felt like wading through molasses. The chanting was unbearable now, drilling into my skull with a force that made me want to collapse. But I didn't stop. I reached the totem and grabbed the largest rock I could find, raising it above my head. The glowing symbols seemed to mock me, their shifting patterns daring me to strike. With a scream that came from somewhere primal, I brought the rock down on the totem. The effect was immediate. A blinding light erupted from the totem, accompanied by a sound that was neither a roar nor a scream, but something inhuman and indescribable. The creature let out a final, anguished howl before collapsing to the ground. Its glowing eyes dimmed, and its massive body began to dissolve into the earth. The forest itself seemed to exhale. The oppressive glow faded, the air became lighter, and the silence was replaced by the faint rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. It was over. I collapsed to the ground, every muscle in my body trembling with exhaustion. My hands were scraped and bloody, and my clothes were torn and caked with dirt, but I was alive. The totem was gone. In its place was a charred patch of earth, smoking faintly. The symbols, the carvings, the grotesque face, everything had been obliterated. I looked around, half expecting the figures to return, but the forest was empty. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. It was almost serene, a stark contrast to the hellscape it had been moments ago. But serenity didn't bring answers. I stumbled through the forest, retracing my steps back to the trailhead. It felt like hours before I finally emerged from the trees, the sight of my car parked at the edge of the woods filling me with a wave of relief. I climbed into the driver's seat and sat there for a long time, staring at the forest. It looked normal now, just an ordinary stretch of trees bathed in the warm light of the setting sun. But I knew better. The events of that day haunted me long after I drove away. What had I unleashed? Was the totem truly destroyed, or had I merely interrupted something far older and more malevolent than I could comprehend? I tried to tell others what had happened, but my story was met with skepticism and pitying smiles. Even those closest to me couldn't believe it, chalking it up to exhaustion or a vivid nightmare. But I knew the truth. The scars on my hands, the strange glow I sometimes caught in my reflection, the nightmares that woke me in a cold sweat, they were all reminders of what I had faced. And the forest? I never went back. Even now, years later, the memories of that day linger like shadows that refuse to fade. They surface in the quiet moments, in the stillness of the night when everything feels too calm. The forest is no longer just a memory. It's a presence, etched into my mind as vividly as if I were still standing on its cursed soil. I often find myself wondering if I truly escaped or if some part of me remains there, trapped with the totem and the creature. There are nights when I wake in a panic, the sound of the chanting ringing in my ears. It feels too real to be a dream, but when I look around, I'm in my bed, the room dimly lit by the glow of the clock. Yet, the forest feels closer than it should. Surviving that ordeal came at a price. The person I was before entering those woods didn't leave with me. There's a permanent edge to my thoughts now, a paranoia that whispers in my ear every time I step into nature. The sight of dense trees, the smell of damp earth, even the soft rustle of leaves in the wind, it all sends a shiver down my spine. I've spent hours trying to rationalize what happened, trying to frame it in terms I can understand. Maybe it was some kind of hallucination, a stress-induced break from reality. But that explanation doesn't account for the scars on my hands or the haunting glow I sometimes catch in my own reflection. If anything, I've learned that some places aren't meant to be understood. They exist on the fringes of what we know, where logic and reason don't apply. The forest was one of those places, a living, breathing enigma that defied every attempt to define it. There's a part of me that wants to go back, not out of curiosity or bravery, but out of an unshakable need for answers. What was the creature? Why was it tied to the totem? And most importantly, is it truly gone? I've tried researching similar accounts, scouring books and forums for any mention of phenomena like what I experienced. There are stories, of course, legends and folklore about cursed woods, spirits, and ancient rituals, but nothing that matches exactly. It's as though the forest guards its secrets jealously, refusing to let the truth slip through the cracks. Sometimes I wonder if someone else will stumble into that place. Will they be drawn to the same strange glow, the same unearthly chanting? And if they do, will they make it out? I can only hope that my destruction of the totem was enough to sever whatever link it had to the world, but the doubt remains. If there's one thing I've taken away from all of this, it's a profound respect for the unknown. The world is full of places that hum with a strange energy, places that seem to breathe and watch and wait. We like to think we're masters of our surroundings, but there are forces out there that remind us how small and powerless we really are. I tell this story not to frighten, but to caution. Be careful where your curiosity takes you. Some paths are best left untraveled, some mysteries best left unsolved. The year was 1987, and I had just turned 23 when I first found myself taking on the responsibility of lighthouse keeper at a small, remote station off the coast of Maine. Growing up, I had always been fascinated by the ocean. I spent my youth on the shore, drawn to its endless horizon, its tides that seemed to carry stories from distant lands. So when the opportunity came to work as a keeper, I saw it as an adventure, a way to escape the monotony of city life and immerse myself in nature. The lighthouse was situated on a rocky outcrop, its towering structure casting a long, jagged shadow on the sea below. From the outside, it looked like the sort of place you'd find in a storybook, a solitary beacon guiding ships safely through the night. But inside, the air was heavy with history and isolation. The rooms were bare, save for the basic necessities: a cot, a table, a small kitchen area, and shelves lined with books from previous keepers. It was a peaceful existence, punctuated only by the rhythmic sound of waves crashing against the rocks and the occasional call of seabirds. My routine was simple. I would wake up at dawn, light the lantern at the top of the lighthouse, and maintain the area around it, making sure the light stayed bright and clear through the night. I was used to the solitude, the quiet hours spent keeping watch over the coast. Some mornings, the fog would roll in thick and silent, blurring the line between sea and sky, and I would sit at the base of the tower, watching it dissipate as the sun rose higher. Other days, the wind would howl, and the saltwater spray would sting my skin as I climbed to check the equipment. I wasn't alone, of course. I shared this remote place with another keeper, an older man named Greg. Greg had been working at the lighthouse for decades, long before I showed up. His graying hair and weathered face seemed to tell the story of the years he had spent here. He was quiet, often lost in his own thoughts, but he had a deep respect for the lighthouse and its traditions. He would teach me the ins and outs of the job, offering little nuggets of wisdom from his years of experience. Lighthouses, he once told me, are more than just beacons for ships. They're sentinels of the sea. They've seen things that the rest of the world doesn't understand. And sometimes those things don't forget. It was one of those odd, cryptic comments that didn't make much sense to me at the time. Greg had a tendency to speak in riddles, like a man who'd been alone too long with his thoughts. But those words lingered in my mind, especially when the nights grew darker and the winds began to shift in strange ways. My first few weeks at the lighthouse were uneventful. Greg and I went about our daily routines, passing the time with the occasional conversation or work project. I remember one evening, as we sat at the small kitchen table eating our dinner of bacon and eggs. The usual fare, Greg looked at me with a strange glint in his eye. "You'll get used to it," he said, "but the place has its own rhythm. It's not always as calm as it seems." I didn't know what he meant then. I thought he was just talking about the weather. But over time, I began to notice oddities. Little things at first, things that didn't make much sense, but still unsettled me: a creak in the floorboards when no one was walking, the sound of footsteps echoing on the stairs late at night, even though Greg and I were the only ones in the building, and the most unsettling of all, the feeling that I was being watched, especially when I stood by the lighthouse window, looking out over the sea. The days slipped by, and life at the lighthouse took on a slow, steady rhythm. I would go on my walks, check the light, and spend the quiet nights reading or reflecting. But something about the place began to gnaw at me. There was an undercurrent of unease that I couldn't shake, like the lighthouse was waiting for something. It wasn't just the isolation. It was something deeper, something older. Greg had mentioned it in passing once or twice: the history of the lighthouse, the long line of keepers who had worked here before us, the ones who had vanished without a trace, the ones who had heard voices in the wind. And then, one evening, something happened that would forever change my perception of the lighthouse. The first sign that something was wrong came on a particularly quiet night. The wind had calmed, and the sea was a dark expanse, only broken by the occasional glimmer of moonlight reflecting off the water. Greg and I were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, nursing mugs of lukewarm coffee. The only sounds in the room were the occasional clink of the spoon against the cup and the creak of the building settling. The silence was oppressive, as though even the house itself was holding its breath. Greg was reading a well-worn book, one of the many left behind by previous keepers, when I noticed the faintest sound. It wasn't loud, just a slight rustling noise, almost like the wind brushing against the walls. but there was no breeze that night. The hair on the back of my neck prickled as I listened more closely. It came again, this time louder, more distinct. Footsteps, soft but deliberate, echoing from above. I froze, my heart suddenly hammering in my chest. "Greg," I said softly, "do you hear that?" Greg didn't look up from his book. "It's just the wind," he muttered, his voice flat, as if he were already tired of hearing these things. He had lived here for too long to be startled by the strange creaks and groans of the lighthouse. But I couldn't shake the feeling. The sound wasn't the wind. It was something else. The footsteps seemed to move across the floor above us, dragging with them an odd resonance, a hollow echo that didn't belong in a building so solid. It was the kind of sound you hear in a place that hasn't been touched in years, a place abandoned, with nothing left but dust and memories. "Greg, I think someone's up there," I pressed, my voice now trembling slightly. Greg finally lowered his book and sighed. "It's just the old building. Happens all the time. You get used to it." But I wasn't used to it. I couldn't shake the unease gnawing at the pit of my stomach. I stood up slowly, my feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor as I moved toward the door. Greg didn't follow me, and he didn't say another word. He had his way of dealing with things, ignoring them, pretending they weren't there. I made my way up the narrow staircase to the upper floor, the footsteps growing louder with each step I took. When I reached the landing, the air felt colder, heavier, as if the building itself had taken a deep breath and was holding it. I turned down the dimly lit hallway that led to the small room above the lighthouse, Greg's room. The footsteps were clearer now, though no one was in sight. I pushed open the door to the room. The darkness inside was thick, almost suffocating. I reached for the light switch and flicked it on, but the bulb sputtered and dimmed, casting long, uneven shadows against the walls. Nothing was there. The room was empty, save for a single chair facing the window, its back to the door. I stepped in further, feeling a chill sweep across the room, and immediately I felt that unsettling presence. Something was watching me. I took a step forward, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, every inch of the room. But there was nothing, just the empty chair and the cold, stale air. I turned back to the door, but before I could leave, I heard it again. A whisper, not loud, but distinct enough to send a shiver crawling down my spine. It wasn't from above or below, or even from the room. It felt like it was coming from inside my own head, a soft, disembodied voice that seemed to wrap around my thoughts. "Get out." I froze. The voice was so clear, so real, I could feel it vibrating inside my chest. I spun around, heart pounding, to find the room still empty. My breath came in shallow gasps as I backed away toward the door, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I stepped into the hallway and almost stumbled into Greg, who was standing at the top of the stairs, his face ashen. "I heard it too," he said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "You should have listened." He didn't need to say more. His expression told me everything I needed to know. Greg had heard the voice before. He had heard the whispers in the wind, the creaks in the floorboards, the footsteps in the dark. And now, it seemed, it was my turn. We stood there for a moment, the air thick with an unspoken tension. There was a fear in Greg's eyes that I hadn't seen before. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown, of something that couldn't be explained. It was a deeper fear, one born from years of living in this haunted place, of knowing that there were things that could not be easily ignored. But I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't just walk away. "What is it?" I asked, my voice shaky. Greg didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned and started walking down the stairs. "You'll learn soon enough," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "You'll learn what happens when you ignore the signs." The following days were eerily quiet. There were no more footsteps or whispers, but that didn't ease the tension in the air. Greg seemed even more withdrawn than before, his focus shifting inward, like a man trying to shut out the world. I spent more time walking along the cliffs or sitting by the lighthouse, trying to shake the dread that clung to me. But no matter how hard I tried, It felt like the lighthouse was always there, watching, waiting. And then, one afternoon, I found something. It wasn't much, but it was enough to shake me to my core. As I was cleaning the room below the lighthouse, I noticed an old journal tucked behind one of the shelves. It was thick, leather-bound, and worn from age. The pages inside were yellowed and frayed, but the handwriting was still legible. I opened it, and as I read, I realized that it belonged to a previous keeper, someone who had worked at the lighthouse many years before. The entries started off innocently enough, detailing the daily tasks of maintaining the light, checking the oil, and tending to the equipment. But as the pages went on, the tone shifted. The keeper began to write about strange occurrences, disembodied voices in the night, shadows that seemed to move on their own, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. The final entry, the last one written before the keeper's disappearance, was chilling. I hear them now. They won't leave. They want something. I don't know what it is, but I can feel them closing in. They're in the walls. They're in the air. I have to leave. I have to. The journal ended abruptly, the final words scrawled hastily, as though the keeper had been interrupted. The rest of the pages were blank. My hands trembled as I closed the journal. I couldn't ignore it any longer. This lighthouse, this place I'd come to love, was hiding something. Something dark, something ancient, something that had claimed the lives of those who had come before me. The days following the discovery of the journal were filled with an unsettling calm. At first, I thought I could dismiss it all. Perhaps the keeper had been driven to madness by the isolation. Maybe the whispers and footsteps were nothing more than the creaks of an old building, the natural sounds of a place long abandoned by its purpose. But deep down, I knew better. I had felt it in the air that first night, the oppressive weight, the way the shadows seemed to stretch and move in ways that defied logic. And the journal. The journal couldn't be ignored. Each night, the house seemed to grow colder. Even when the fire crackled in the hearth, there was a lingering chill in the air, like the place was rejecting warmth. It was hard to ignore how it felt like something was watching us, something old and forgotten. Even Greg seemed on edge. He would pace at odd hours, stopping only when he thought I wasn't looking. And the sound of footsteps at first, they had been an occasional echo, but now they were relentless. Every night, I heard them soft and slow, but steady, always above us, always in the dark. I tried to bring it up to Greg, but each time I did, he would dismiss it with a hollow, "It's nothing," or "You'll get used to it." But I could see in his eyes that he wasn't as unaffected as he let on. Something had shifted in him, too. I caught him muttering to himself at times, his voice low, as though he were trying to reason with something or someone. But when I asked, he would only say, "It's the lighthouse. It gets to you." One evening, after an unusually restless night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. I had to find out what was happening in this place. I couldn't let it consume me like it had Greg. I couldn't let it drive me to the same state of paranoia and fear. I decided to explore the upper levels of the lighthouse. The rooms had always been off limits to me. Greg had insisted that they were unsafe, unstable. But I had to know the truth. It had been bothering me for days. What if something was hidden up there? What if there was more to the story than Greg had told me? The stairs leading up to the lighthouse tower creaked under my weight as I ascended, each step feeling like it was echoing into the depths of the building. The scent of saltwater and mildew clung to the air, and the farther I went up, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The wind howled outside, and the lighthouse shuddered with each gust. But inside, it was silent. Too silent. I reached the small, narrow door that led to the tower itself, the place where the light was housed. There was a sense of finality when I touched the cold handle, as though opening this door would mark the point of no return. I hesitated for only a moment before I turned it, the metal scraping against the frame. The door swung open with a protest groan. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the tall, narrow windows that lined the circular walls. The light itself, the massive, glass-enclosed beacon, sat dormant, its lens covered in dust. I approached it cautiously, my footsteps muffled by the thick, worn rug on the floor. The air was thick and heavy, like the room had been holding its breath for years. As I stepped closer to the beacon, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I froze, my hand just inches from the glass, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no sound, no movement, but I knew, deep in my bones, that I wasn't alone. A cold breeze stirred around me, though the windows were shut tight. The walls, once solid, now felt soft, as though they were breathing with me. I took a few more cautious steps, scanning every corner of the room. And that's when I saw something out of place, something that shouldn't have been there. In the farthest corner, almost hidden behind a stack of old, rotting crates, was a small door. It was half open, revealing a darkened hallway beyond. The floor creaked as I moved toward it, my body trembling with a mix of fear and curiosity. I pushed the door open, the wood groaning against the frame, and stepped into the narrow corridor. The air was thick with dust and decay, and the walls seemed to close in around me. As I walked deeper into the hallway, I felt the temperature drop. My breath became visible in the cold air, and I could feel a tingling sensation on the back of my neck. I turned a corner, and that's when I saw them shapes, vague and indistinct, just beyond the reach of the dim light from the tower. At first, I thought it was my imagination playing tricks on me, but then they moved. There was no sound, no footsteps, no whispering, just the shapes shifting in the darkness. My heart skipped a beat as I backed away, my mind racing. I wanted to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shapes. They seemed to be watching me, following my every movement with an unnerving intensity. Suddenly, there was a loud crash behind me. I spun around, my heart racing. The sound of something heavy falling to the ground echoed through the hallway, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was drawing closer. My pulse quickened, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know what was behind me, but I had to. I slowly turned my head, my eyes scanning the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. But then, just as I thought I had imagined it, a figure appeared at the far end of the hallway. It was tall, its form blurred and indistinct, like it was made of shadow rather than flesh. It moved toward me slowly, its footsteps silent on the creaking floor. I took a step back, but my legs felt like lead. I was rooted to the spot, frozen by the sheer terror of the figure. The temperature in the hallway dropped even further, the air thick with a palpable sense of dread. I could see its face now, or rather, I could see the absence of it, a hollow void where its features should have been, an endless darkness that seemed to stretch inward. "Get out!" The voice from before echoed in my mind, louder this time, more urgent. Without thinking, I turned and fled, my feet barely touching the floor as I bolted down the hallway. The sound of my own breathing was deafening, and I could hear the faint scraping of something following me, just out of reach. I reached the door to the tower and threw myself through it, slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against it, my heart hammering in my chest, the cold sweat running down my back. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The world felt like it was spinning, my mind unable to process what had just happened. I stumbled back, and that's when I saw Greg standing at the foot of the stairs, his eyes wide, his face pale. "You shouldn't have gone up there," he whispered. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I was too shaken, too terrified to speak. But Greg didn't need words. He had seen it too. He had felt it too. We were no longer just two men in a lighthouse. We were now prisoners, trapped by something ancient, something that had waited for us. The air was thick with it, now the presence. And I knew, deep down, that there was no escaping it. Not anymore. The events of that night had brought a creeping sense of doom that I couldn't shake. Every inch of me screamed to leave, to run away from the lighthouse, from whatever force was haunting it. But even as I stood there, my pulse pounding and my breath shallow, I realized there was no escape. Greg had said it once, and I was beginning to believe it. There was no escaping this place, not anymore. The lighthouse had us, and whatever was inside it, whatever was in the shadows, was not going to let us go without a fight. The following days were filled with an eerie silence. Greg was quieter than usual, his eyes hollow, and I could see the weight of the experience wearing on him. We spoke little about what we had encountered. The terror was too much, too overwhelming for words. I kept trying to block it from my mind, but the images of the shadowed figure in the hallways wouldn't fade. The dark void that was its face, that feeling of being stalked by something not quite alive, it was too real to forget. And then came the night that would change everything. It started like any other night, cold, with the wind howling against the lighthouse. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below was constant, deafening. I could hear the distant calls of seagulls and the creaks of the old wood beneath our feet. But something was different this time. There was an odd energy in the air, something heavy that made my skin crawl, something I couldn't explain. I had been sitting near the fire, trying to focus on the journal again. The pages, once so full of haunting scribbles, seemed more urgent now, like they were trying to tell me something. I had read the words over and over again, but it wasn't until that night that I saw the pattern, something I had missed before. The journal had spoken of the keeper, yes, but it had also mentioned something else, something far darker. The curse of the keeper. Those words kept repeating, growing bolder and more frantic as I read. And then, right at the end, was the last entry. It was hastily written, almost a scrawl, and it made no sense at first. But as I stared at it, the meaning became clear, and my blood ran cold. It was a warning about us. We were meant to stay. We were meant to be the new keepers. There was no leaving the lighthouse once you entered. And the spirits of the old keepers? They were still here, still trapped, unable to rest. My hands trembled as I lowered the journal, my mind racing. What was happening? What was happening to us? The idea that we might be forced to stay here, forever, like the previous keepers, was too horrifying to process. And then the whispers began again. They had been silent for days, but now they returned, soft at first, just a murmur in the corner of my hearing, a faint rustling of air. But it wasn't the wind. I looked toward the stairs leading up to the tower. A figure stood at the top, cloaked in darkness. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its presence. It was like the room itself had shifted, and it was no longer just me and Greg. Something else was here, something old and angry. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Greg, who had been sitting across from me, turned his head slowly toward the figure, his face going pale, his mouth slightly agape. He knew. He had seen it too. "Greg," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Greg, we need to leave. Now." But he didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared, his eyes wide, like a man who had seen a ghost. He was trapped in the same fear I was, but for some reason, he didn't seem as desperate to flee. His gaze never wavered from the figure standing in the doorway, which was now moving closer. The room grew colder. My teeth chattered as I pushed myself up from the chair, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The figure was now descending the stairs, moving toward us with a slow, deliberate pace. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. I turned to run, but as I did, I felt something cold grip my ankle. It pulled me back, hard, slamming me to the floor. I screamed in pain, my body crashing against the wood. The room spun around me, the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. I could feel it now, an icy, suffocating presence, like the very air had turned to lead. I scrambled to get up, but the cold grip on my ankle only tightened. I tried to yank my leg free, but it was useless. My heart raced, and my breathing grew shallow. Then the figure was right in front of me. It was no longer just a shadow, it was real. It was a man, or had once been. His clothes were tattered and worn, but it was his face that caught my attention. Or, rather, the lack of one. His face was an empty void, a black hole of nothingness. There was no skin, no features, just a deep, endless darkness where his eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. It was like staring into the abyss. And then he spoke. "Stay. Stay with me. Forever." His voice was low and guttural, as though it came from somewhere deep beneath the earth, far removed from anything human. It sent a shock of cold through my entire body. The darkness around us seemed to thicken, and I could feel my body weakening, my vision fading in and out. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My mouth was dry, and the air felt thick, suffocating. I could see Greg now, his eyes wide and glazed over, like he had entered a trance. He didn't move, didn't blink. He was staring at the figure with a mix of fear and resignation, like he had already given up. The figure reached out, its cold, skeletal hand hovering over me. I could feel the temperature in the room drop even further. The cold was unbearable, and it seemed to seep into my bones, numbing me from the inside out. And then, just as I thought it was all over, I felt the warmth of the fire behind me. It was faint, but it was there. I reached out, my hand shaking as I grabbed the edge of the hearth. With one final burst of energy, I pushed myself forward, breaking free from the cold grip that had held me. I didn't look back. I didn't have to. I ran, stumbling over the floor, heading for the door. Behind me, I heard the figure's voice, now louder, angrier. "Stay with me. Forever." I reached the door and threw it open, running out into the night air. The wind whipped against my face, the waves crashing violently against the rocks below. I ran as fast as I could, my legs aching, my chest burning with each breath. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away. And when I turned to look back, the lighthouse stood silent in the distance, its light flickering faintly in the darkness. It was still there, and I knew, deep down, that I would never escape it. I could feel my legs trembling as I ran through the cold night, the wind howling in my ears, and the sound of the crashing waves beneath me offering no comfort. The door to the lighthouse was still wide open, a dark void waiting to pull me back in. But I couldn't look back, not now, not ever again. I couldn't shake the image of the figure with its empty face, its cold, hollow hand reaching for me. I ran for what felt like hours, my breath ragged and uneven. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I half expected to see the lighthouse looming behind me, its light flashing in the distance like a warning. But as the night stretched on, the lighthouse slowly disappeared from view. It was as if it had never been there in the first place. The night swallowed it whole, and I was left with nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my chest. Eventually, I found myself stumbling onto the road that led away from the cliffs, my body shaking with exhaustion. The sight of the distant town gave me some comfort, and I kept moving forward, my mind racing with everything that had happened. How had things gotten so out of control? What was it that we had encountered in that lighthouse? And most pressing of all, why was I still alive? As I reached the first sign of civilization, a small village just outside the cliffs, I finally stopped, collapsing against a tree for support. My knees gave way beneath me, and I felt the tears well up in my eyes. The terror had drained everything from me, leaving me hollow and exhausted. I could still hear the figure's voice in my head, urging me to stay with it forever. The thought of returning to the lighthouse, of confronting whatever cursed force still lingered there, was unbearable. I had to find Greg. I forced myself to stand, my muscles aching with every movement. The idea of going back to the lighthouse, of facing whatever had claimed Greg, was almost too much to bear. But I had to do it. He was my friend, and no matter what happened, I couldn't leave him behind. With a deep breath, I began to make my way back to the lighthouse. The path felt different this time, darker, colder. The wind seemed to pick up again, howling through the trees, and the distant sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs felt ominous, like a warning. When I reached the base of the lighthouse, I could see that the door was still ajar, just as I had left it. The place felt wrong, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I hesitated for a moment, but then pushed the door open, stepping back into the eerie silence that had consumed the place. Inside, everything was still. The fire I had started earlier had gone out, leaving the room dim and cold. The journal I had been reading was still on the table, but now the pages were blank, as if they had been erased. There were no signs of life, no signs of movement. It was as if the entire lighthouse had gone still, frozen in time. I called out for Greg, my voice trembling. "Greg? Are you here?" There was no answer. I moved cautiously through the lighthouse, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadows seemed to shift in the corners of my vision, flickering like the remnants of a nightmare. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the windows sent a jolt of fear through me. I was alone, but I wasn't. The presence was still here, lurking in the walls, in the very air I breathed. Upstairs, I found him. Greg was sitting by the window, staring out at the dark ocean, his face pale, his eyes wide. He didn't acknowledge me when I called his name. His hands were trembling, his body rigid, as if he were locked in place by some unseen force. He looked like a shell of the man I had known, hollow and broken. "Greg?" I asked again, my voice cracking. "Greg, we have to leave. Now. This place, it's not safe." His head turned slowly, and I could see the terror in his eyes. But there was something else too, something I couldn't quite place. He didn't speak for a long time, and when he finally did, his voice was barely a whisper. "I can't leave," he said, his voice hollow. I'm part of it now. I can feel it. The keeper is here, and it wants us to stay." His words sent a chill down my spine. He sounded lost, as though the lighthouse had already taken hold of him, pulled him into its grasp. The figure I had seen earlier, the one with the empty face, wasn't just some manifestation of fear. It was real, and now Greg was part of it. "I won't stay," I said firmly, trying to pull him away from the window. "We have to get out of here, Greg. You don't have to be a part of this. We can still leave." But he pulled away from me, his eyes wild with fear. "You don't understand. It's too late. The keeper has already chosen us. We're stuck here. We're trapped." His words were like a punch to the gut, and I felt the panic rise in me again. He was slipping away, becoming something else, something I couldn't reach. It was too much. The thought of being trapped here, of being consumed by the very place we had tried to escape, was unbearable. I stepped back, my mind racing, trying to find a way out. The lighthouse was alive with something dark, something ancient. It had claimed Greg, and it wanted more. The door, once a means of escape, now seemed like a cruel joke. There was no leaving. But just as I was about to give up, a thought struck me. The journal, there had to be a way to break the curse, to end the hold this place had on us. I couldn't let it take both of us. Not without a fight. I rushed down the stairs, grabbing the journal from the table. The pages were still blank, but I knew there was a key in them. There had to be. I flipped through the pages frantically, my hands shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Then, in the very back of the journal, I found it a single line of text, written in a hurried, desperate hand. "To leave, you must take the keeper's place." I froze. The meaning was clear. To escape, one of us had to stay behind. One of us had to become the new keeper. I ran back upstairs to Greg, my heart breaking. He was still staring out the window, lost in his thoughts, but I could see the terror still in his eyes. He was slipping further away with every passing moment. I had no choice. "I'll stay," I said, my voice trembling with finality. "I'll stay. You can go. You deserve to live." Greg turned to me, his eyes wide. "No, I can't let you. It's too late for me." But I had already made up my mind. I would stay. I couldn't let this place take him. I walked to the center of the room, feeling the air grow heavier around me. I could sense the presence now, stronger than ever, swirling around the lighthouse. The keeper was here, watching, waiting for one of us to make the choice. "Goodbye, Greg," I whispered. I felt the cold grip of the lighthouse begin to take hold of me, pulling me into its dark depths. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the inevitable, as I heard the sound of Greg's footsteps retreating behind me. And as the darkness closed in, I knew I had made my choice. I would become the keeper. As for Greg, I'll never know if he made it out. The lighthouse consumed everything in its path, and I don't think he was ever truly able to leave. The last thing I heard before the darkness swallowed me completely, was his voice calling my name, and I could never answer. I don't know how long I've been here now, trapped within the walls of this forsaken lighthouse. Time no longer seems to follow the same rules it once did. The hours blur together, the days pass in an endless cycle of darkness and light, but none of it feels real. Everything has become part of the same oppressive void that lingers in the very bones of this place. Some days I still hear Greg's voice calling out to me from the distance, faint whispers riding the wind, but I know they are only echoes of the past. I no longer respond. There's no use. There's nothing left to go back to. The keeper's place has claimed me, and I have become part of the very thing I feared. I am now the lighthouse keeper. At first, I tried to resist. I fought the pull of the darkness that wanted to swallow me whole. I fought against the whispers that filled my mind, urging me to stay, to guard the secrets of this cursed place. But with each passing day, I feel myself fading more and more. The lighthouse is always watching. It knows when I'm awake, when I'm restless, when I'm lost in memories of days before this nightmare began. I can feel it tightening its grip around me, slowly eroding my will, until I am nothing but a hollow shell, a keeper trapped in its endless cycle. There are moments when I catch glimpses of the world beyond, but it's always fleeting. The waves crash violently against the cliffs, and the wind howls as if warning me to never leave. It's as though the lighthouse itself is a barrier, keeping the outside world at bay, just out of reach. Sometimes I stand at the window, staring out into the endless sea, wondering if anyone still remembers the lighthouse. I wonder if anyone still remembers me. But the longer I stay, the less I am certain that anyone would even care. I don't know what has become of the world outside. The lighthouse has a way of warping time, distorting reality until nothing seems to matter anymore. The line between past and present blurs. I've stopped thinking about the town I once called home, the people I left behind. They are mere fragments of a forgotten dream. The only thing that remains is the lighthouse. I can feel its pulse now. It hums in the walls, beneath the floorboards, in the very air I breathe. It is alive. It has always been alive. The keeper's place is more than just a title, it's a transformation. I've become a part of it. I can hear its whispers when I try to sleep, calling me to tend to its light, to keep its watch, to never let it fade. I am its servant, bound to it for eternity, just as Greg was before me. I wonder if this is the fate of all who come to the lighthouse. They say there are others who have vanished in these cliffs, lost to the sea, swallowed by the darkness that lurks just beyond the reach of the light. Perhaps they too were chosen. Perhaps they too became part of the lighthouse, the eternal keeper, never able to leave. The thought terrifies me, but it also fills me with an odd sense of understanding. There is no escape. Not for me, and not for anyone who steps foot in this cursed place. I no longer feel the need to fight. The lighthouse has claimed me, just as it claimed Greg, just as it will claim anyone who dares to enter its domain. Perhaps in time, I will forget the world outside entirely. Perhaps I will forget the man I used to be, the memories of escape, of running away from the keeper's call. But for now, I am here. Every night, I light the lantern, watching as the beam cuts through the darkness. I stand on the balcony, staring out at the sea, my mind slowly becoming one with the rhythm of the lighthouse. I am the keeper, and I always will be. Sometimes, when I look out at the waves crashing against the rocks below, I think of Greg. I wonder if he ever found peace, if he managed to leave. But deep down, I know the truth. He's here, somewhere, bound to this place like I am. We are all part of it now. There is no escape from the keeper's grip. The weather was perfect sunny, with just the right amount of cool breeze. We'd been looking for something new to do, and that's when we stumbled across it, an old amusement park on the outskirts of town. To be honest, none of us had heard of it before, but that only made it more intriguing. The idea of exploring an abandoned theme park sounded like the kind of adventure we'd been craving. It was a classic, let's do something crazy idea, and we were all for it. There were four of us on that trip: me, Ben, Luke, and Clara. We had been friends for years, always looking for something to do on weekends to break free from the usual routine. Our daily lives consisted of work, school, and the occasional night out. Nothing too exciting. We weren't thrill seekers by any means, but the idea of an abandoned park in our sleepy little town was enough to pique our curiosity. We piled into Luke's car, the one that always smelled faintly of fast food, and had a collection of maps strewn across the back seat. It didn't take long for us to find the place, though we weren't exactly sure where it was located at first. The directions we found were vague, mentioning an old theme park just past a row of trees, but there was no official signage or advertisements. It felt like the kind of secret place you'd only hear about from someone who'd been there, and then immediately regret telling you about. As we neared the location, the world seemed to fall into a quiet lull. The roads narrowed, trees thickened, and a sense of isolation settled in. Luke joked that this was probably the point where we'd end up getting lost forever, like in one of those creepy movies, but none of us took him seriously. After all, it was just an old park. How dangerous could it be? Finally, we turned off the main road and onto a dusty gravel path, the type that was barely wide enough for the car. I remember Clara nervously asking if we were sure this was the right way. Her voice was faint, but she wasn't scared, just cautious, as always. Ben, on the other hand, was full of excitement. He was already talking about what we might find in the park. Old rides, decaying roller coasters, maybe even some forgotten memorabilia. The kind of things you could only imagine from stories or pictures of places long since abandoned. We parked near the entrance, or what was left of it. The gate was rusted, and the ticket booth had collapsed in on itself, covered in ivy. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years, decades even. Yet, there was a strange charm to it, like it was waiting for someone to come back and bring it to life once more. It was eerie, but also oddly beautiful in its decay. It wasn't exactly what we had imagined, though. We thought we'd be walking into a few empty rides and overgrown pathways. What we found was far more disturbing than we could have ever guessed. The entire place seemed frozen in time. The sound of our footsteps echoed strangely in the air, and the wind blew through the skeletons of the rides, making them creak as if they were alive. As we walked further into the park, we saw remnants of a world that had long been forgotten. Faded signs hung from twisted posts, barely readable. A broken carousel stood in the center of the park, its horses frozen in mid-gallop, their eyes blank and hollow. It was the kind of scene you see in horror movies where the beauty of the place is overshadowed by its eerie, forsaken nature. We spent the next few hours wandering around, taking pictures and making jokes to mask the tension that was beginning to build. Luke dared Ben to climb onto the rusted Ferris wheel, and Clara and I stood below, laughing as Ben pretended to be a daredevil. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the desolation of the place, it was the silence. The way the wind would brush through the trees without making a sound, and how even our voices seemed muted, as though the park didn't want us to disturb its peace. We decided to head toward the back of the park, to what used to be the entrance to the haunted house attraction. There was a crumbling path leading toward it, and I remember feeling drawn to it, almost as if something was pulling me in. I wasn't scared at that point, just curious, like the others. But there was something about the place that felt off. Even Ben, who was usually the first to jump into anything, seemed hesitant. We were standing in front of the haunted house when I first noticed it. It was subtle at first, just a flicker in the corner of my eye. I turned to Ben and Clara, about to say something, but before I could speak, the door to the haunted house creaked open on its own. A cold gust of wind rushed past us, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We all froze, staring at the open door. Ben laughed nervously. "It's just the wind, right?" But the door didn't close. It stayed open, inviting us inside. As we stood there in front of the open door to the abandoned haunted house, a cold shiver ran down my spine. It was hard to explain why the simple act of a door opening in the wind made my heart race, but there was something about it, something off that I couldn't quite shake. We were all standing there, frozen for a moment, staring at the dark void beyond the door. The air felt heavier now, as though it was thick with something that didn't belong. The wind, which had been so soft and gentle moments before, suddenly felt harsher, colder. I took a step forward without realizing it, compelled by something I couldn't explain. Ben, ever the skeptic, was the first to speak, trying to brush off the unease that had settled around us. He chuckled, his voice a little forced. "It's just an old building. The hinges are probably just worn out. It happens." Clara, who had been unusually quiet up until that point, gave him a doubtful look. "It's not just that, though. Why did it open like that?" I didn't hear anything. It was almost like something made it open. I didn't say anything, but her words struck a chord. It was exactly what I had been thinking. We were standing there in complete silence, not a bird chirping or wind rustling through the trees. Just the oppressive silence of the park that seemed to swallow every sound. The only noise was the faint creaking of the old rides and that eerie wind. It was unsettling. Ben, sensing the growing tension, waved it off. "Come on, let's go inside. Nothing's gonna happen." He stepped forward, pushing past me, his bravado a clear attempt to mask the unease creeping into his own voice. Clara hesitated, but I could see her curiosity winning out. "I don't know. It just feels wrong." I agreed with her, but at the same time, I couldn't deny that I was drawn to the house. The idea of exploring it, uncovering its secrets, was too tempting. So, against my better judgment, I followed Ben inside, and Clara reluctantly trailed behind. The haunted house was a shadow of its former self. The walls, once covered in vibrant colors and eerie designs, were now peeling and fading. The floors creaked under our feet, and the faint smell of mildew mixed with the stale air inside. It was everything I had imagined in the sense that it was eerie and dilapidated, but it felt even worse than I had expected. It wasn't just an abandoned house, it was a place that had been left to rot, forgotten by time. And yet, something about it felt watched, like we weren't as alone as we thought. We moved deeper into the house, our footsteps echoing against the walls. The rooms were full of broken furniture, shards of glass, and remnants of past lives. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few seconds, as if I was expecting someone or something to be standing there. The house was silent except for the sounds of our movements. That silence, though, started to feel heavier, like it was pressing in on us from all sides. I glanced at Ben, who was ahead of me, trying to hide his nervousness behind a fake laugh. "This place is a dump," he said, his voice too loud, as though trying to convince himself that everything was normal. "They probably just left it here to rot because no one cared anymore." Clara was ahead of me now, her footsteps slow and deliberate. She turned to look back at us. Did anyone hear that? We all stopped. My heart thudded in my chest. It wasn't the wind or the creaking of the building. It was something else. A faint noise, almost like whispers, coming from the other end of the hallway. I could barely make it out, but it sounded like voices low, murmuring voices, too distant to understand, but too clear to ignore. "What was that?" I whispered, even though I didn't want to hear the answer. Ben, as though to dismiss it, shook his head. "It's just the building settling. Probably just rats or something." But Clara wasn't convinced. "No, it wasn't that. I heard voices." I swear I did. We stood there in the darkness for a moment, each of us processing the sounds we had just heard. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but I couldn't think of one. The atmosphere had shifted, the air thick with unease. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The house didn't just feel abandoned, it felt alive, in a way that I couldn't explain. We moved deeper into the hallway, the air growing colder as we went. My breath became visible in the air, each exhale forming a small cloud. Ben's bravado had begun to slip. He walked ahead of me, but I could tell he was trying to mask the discomfort he felt. Clara stayed close, glancing nervously at every corner, her eyes darting around, searching the shadows for whatever had made the noise. It wasn't until we reached the end of the hallway that things really took a turn. There, at the farthest corner, was an old mirror. It was cracked, covered in dust, but it stood out among the decay like something that didn't belong. As we walked past it, I couldn't help but glance into it, expecting to see my reflection. But instead of seeing my face, I saw something else. For just a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure standing behind me. It wasn't clear at first, just a shadow, but it was enough to make my heart stop. I spun around, my pulse racing, but the hallway was empty. There was nothing but the cracked walls and the remnants of the past. "You all right?" Ben asked, noticing my sudden panic. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Clara, who had also seen my reaction, looked at the mirror nervously, but said nothing. The sense of unease was growing stronger, the tension palpable in the air. We decided to leave that part of the house and move on, but as we turned back to the hallway, I heard the noise again. This time, it was closer than I wanted it to be. The voices. They were no longer whispers. They were clear now, rising and falling in an unintelligible rhythm. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound was unmistakable. "Did you hear that?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I hear it," I said, my voice shaking. "We need to go." But Ben wasn't having it. "Come on. It's just..." Before he could finish, the door at the far end of the hallway slammed shut. The loud bang of it echoing throughout the house, sending a jolt of panic through all of us. The noise, followed by the cold, dry gust of wind that blew through the house, was enough to send us running. We didn't look back. We just ran, our footsteps echoing against the walls as we made our way toward the exit. The feeling of being watched, of something following us, was overwhelming. It was as if the house was alive, breathing, and it didn't want us to leave. By the time we reached the front door, I could feel the sweat running down my neck, my breath heavy and shallow. As we stepped outside into the relative safety of the open air, the wind seemed to carry away the oppressive feeling, but the unsettling noise, the voices still lingered in my ears. We stood there for a moment, catching our breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But no one spoke. No one had to. The look on all our faces said it all. Something was wrong with that place, something far darker than we had ever imagined. The days following our visit to the abandoned amusement park were some of the most unnerving I've ever experienced. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was all in our heads. The wind, the creaking of old doors, the strange sounds, it all had logical explanations. But with each passing day, those explanations seemed less and less convincing. Clara was the first to bring it up. She'd been texting me late at night, her messages full of questions and doubts. I tried to calm her down, telling her that we had overreacted, but deep down, I wasn't so sure anymore. It was the third night after our visit when things took a darker turn. I had just finished working late and was on my way home when I received a call from Ben. His voice sounded strained, as if he was trying to keep it together. "You need to come over," he said, his words rushed. "Something's happening. It's not just us." "What are you talking about?" I asked, confusion creeping into my voice. I was already on edge from the strange things I had been feeling lately. "Just come over. I'll explain when you get here." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door, my mind racing. What could Ben mean by, "It's not just us"? When I arrived at his apartment, Clara was already there, sitting on the couch, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. The tension in the room was palpable. Something was very wrong. "All right, what's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been lingering since that night at the amusement park was now coming to a head. Ben stood up from his chair and walked toward the window, glancing out nervously as if expecting someone or something to be there. "It's been happening ever since we left the park," he said, his voice low. "I've been hearing things, seeing things. It's like I'm being followed." "Like what?" I asked, my curiosity piqued despite the growing sense of dread in my chest. Ben hesitated for a moment, as if he wasn't sure whether or not to tell us the full extent of what he'd been experiencing. "I've been seeing shadows, moving in the corners of my eyes. At first, I thought it was just the dark or my imagination, but it's not. Last night, I saw one of them. It was in the hallway, standing still, just watching." Clara shuddered at the mention of the word watching. I could see she was on edge too, her eyes darting to the corners of the room, as if expecting someone or something to appear. "I've been hearing voices," she added, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not just faint whispers either. I hear them clearly now, and sometimes when I'm alone, I feel like someone is standing right behind me, watching me." I felt a chill run down my spine. It was as though every one of my worst fears was slowly creeping up on me, gathering strength. I wanted to brush it off, to tell them it was all in our heads. But as I looked at their faces, I knew they weren't imagining it. They were terrified. We spent the next few hours talking in hushed voices, each of us recounting strange occurrences we had experienced in the days since our visit to the park. The more we talked, the more it became clear that whatever was happening to us wasn't normal. It wasn't just in our heads. Something was happening, and it was connected to that damn place. At some point, we agreed that we needed to go back. There was no other choice. We had to confront whatever it was that had latched onto us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being drawn into something bigger than ourselves. But even as I thought that, I couldn't deny the fear clawing in my insides. I wanted to leave it all behind, forget about the haunted house and the voices, but I knew deep down that I couldn't. We couldn't. Not until we understood what was happening. The next day, we met up at the park in the late afternoon, the sun beginning to set behind the rusted roller coasters and broken down attractions. The air was thick with the scent of decaying wood and metal, and the wind had picked up again, making the old rides creak eerily in the distance. We stood at the gates, staring at the broken fences and shattered windows, feeling the weight of the decision we had made. "This is a bad idea," Clara said quietly, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. "We shouldn't be here. We don't know what we're dealing with." "I know," I replied, my voice sounding far more certain than I felt. "But we have to do this. We have no other choice." We stepped through the gates, the crunch of gravel beneath our feet the only sound as we made our way toward the haunted house. As we walked, I noticed that the air felt different, heavier, colder. It was like the park itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We reached the house without incident, the door still standing open, as though inviting us inside. But when we stepped through the threshold, the feeling of unease intensified. The air inside was thick with dust and mildew, but it felt more oppressive than before. The silence was deafening, as if the building itself was holding its breath. We explored the house, moving from room to room, searching for anything that might explain what was happening. But everything seemed normal, or at least as normal as an abandoned house could be. The furniture was still in pieces, the walls still covered in peeling paint. The only thing that seemed out of place was the overwhelming feeling of being watched, of something lingering just out of sight. It wasn't until we reached the back room, the one we had avoided the first time, that things took a turn. The door, which had been slightly ajar before, was now wide open. Inside, the air was colder than it had been anywhere else in the house. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering erratically. I stepped inside, followed closely by Ben and Clara. As soon as we entered, the temperature dropped even further. I could see my breath in the air, forming small clouds in the dim light. And that's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, there was a large, ornate mirror. It wasn't cracked or broken like the others, but it was covered in a thick layer of dust. The mirror reflected the dim light of the bulb, but as I looked closer, I noticed something strange. The reflection wasn't quite right. The image in the mirror seemed to move, shifting in subtle ways that I couldn't explain. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I saw it clearly. A shadow, tall and indistinct, standing just behind me in the reflection. I spun around, but the room was empty. Nothing was there. The others saw it too, their faces pale as they looked from the mirror to the empty space behind me. "What is that?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. "But I think we need to get out of here. Now." But as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind us with a force that made the entire house shake. The flickering light bulb went out, plunging us into complete darkness. The only sound was the thumping of our hearts, the deafening silence pressing in on us. And then we heard it again. The voices. Only this time, they were clearer, louder, more distinct. "Leave. Now." We froze, our bodies rigid with fear. The voices weren't just whispers anymore. They were commands demanding, urgent, and filled with something dark. The air around us grew cold, the oppressive weight of it almost suffocating. And as we stood there, paralyzed with fear, the darkness seemed to close in around us. Something was in the house with us. Something we couldn't see, but could feel with every fiber of our being. Something we had awakened. The darkness felt suffocating as we stood frozen in that room, the air thick with the cold and the oppressive weight of something unseen. My heart pounded in my chest as the eerie voices echoed in the darkness around us, a relentless, low hum that seemed to fill every corner of the room. The fear that had been building in us over the past few days exploded now, a deep, primal terror that made every muscle in my body tense and my mind race. What were we dealing with? What had we unleashed? Ben, standing just beside me, was the first to break the silence. He muttered something under his breath, his voice shaking as he fumbled for his phone. The light from the screen illuminated his face briefly before it flickered and went out. Clara let out a small gasp, her face pale, and I could hear her breath catching in her throat. "Get it together," I hissed, trying to regain control. "We need to move now." But before I could even take a step, the room seemed to shift. The walls, which had been still and decaying only moments ago, now seemed to pulse, as if the entire building were alive. The floor beneath us creaked, and I felt a tremor beneath my feet, like something large was moving just out of sight. My breath came faster, and I could taste the fear on my tongue, a bitter, metallic taste that seemed to cling to the air. "Did you hear that?" Clara whispered, her voice quivering. I barely had time to register her question before the shadows in the corner of the room began to shift slowly, deliberately. The figure in the mirror, the one I had seen just moments before, was now moving in real time. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally, twitching as if it was not entirely sure of its form. And then it stepped forward, a dark mass that seemed to absorb the light around it. My body went rigid with fear, and I instinctively reached for Clara's arm. Ben stumbled back, his face twisted in shock as he stared at the thing in the mirror. The air in the room grew colder, almost unbearably so, as if the temperature had dropped dozens of degrees in seconds. A cold, biting wind seemed to emanate from the mirror, and in that moment, I realized that the figure wasn't just a reflection. It was real. I had seen enough horror movies in my life to know that this wasn't something that could be reasoned with. I knew we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding. Something ancient, something dark. "Run!" I shouted, turning toward the door. But it was too late. The door, which had been closed moments ago, was now wide open, its frame distorted as if the very structure of the building was warping. The thing from the mirror, if that was even what it was, moved toward us with an unnatural, jerky pace. It didn't walk, it glided, its shadowy form undulating like smoke. I could hear its footsteps, each one slow and deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. Ben didn't hesitate. His eyes locked onto the door, and he bolted, pulling Clara behind him. But before any of us could take more than a few steps, the room seemed to close in on us. The walls, which had been dilapidated and crumbling just moments ago, now loomed overhead like giants, towering over us in a way that was completely unnatural. We had to move, we had to get out. I turned to look back, just for a moment. What I saw made my stomach drop. The figure was closer now, much closer, its grotesque, misshapen face still obscured by shadows. Its long fingers reached out toward us, slowly, deliberately, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, faintly red, like embers burning in the dark. I couldn't make out the rest of its features, but I didn't need to. The terror that washed over me was enough to tell me everything I needed to know. "Go now," I shouted, my voice filled with urgency. Clara's eyes were wide with panic as she ran, stumbling over debris and broken furniture in her desperate attempt to escape. I could hear her breathing, shallow and erratic, as she tried to keep up with Ben, who was already halfway to the door. But the moment we reached the threshold, the world around us seemed to warp again, and I felt a sudden, crushing force press against my chest. It was like trying to move through thick, viscous water. My limbs felt heavy, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. The hallway that had once seemed so long now stretched out in front of us like an endless void. It felt as if the park was swallowing us whole, pulling us deeper into its grasp. I could hear Clara gasping for breath, her panic rising as she scrambled ahead. Then, a voice loud and clear echoed through the hall. "You will never escape." The words were not spoken by any of us, but by something else. Something that resonated deep in my bones, chilling me to my core. The voice was low, almost guttural, and it reverberated through the walls, the floor, and my very soul. We all froze. It wasn't just the voice, though. The room seemed to hum with an energy I couldn't comprehend, a hum that grew louder and louder until it became a physical pressure, pushing in on us from all sides. The temperature plummeted further, and I could see my breath in front of me, my every exhale visible in the frigid air. It felt like the very walls were closing in on us, squeezing us tighter with every passing second. "Keep moving," I shouted, my voice cracking from the fear that was tightening my throat. We ran down the hallway, but no matter how fast we moved, it seemed as though the exit was growing further away. The walls stretched, the shadows deepened, and the sound of our footsteps grew muffled, as if the very space itself was warping to trap us inside. It was then that I realized just how close we were to something ancient, something beyond the physical world. And then, as I glanced over my shoulder, I saw it again. The figure from the mirror was behind us, its form now no longer distorted by the reflective glass. It was real, flesh and bone, or what could pass for it. Its face was an impossibility, with eyes that burned like coals and a mouth that opened impossibly wide. There was no sound when it opened its mouth, but I could feel the pressure of it, as if the air itself was being sucked into that darkness. We couldn't outrun it. We couldn't escape it. But then, just as it was almost upon us, the world shifted again, this time violently. The ground shook beneath us, and the walls cracked as if the entire building was coming apart. The lights flickered on and off in rapid succession, casting wild, erratic shadows across the hallway. I could hear Clara scream, but I couldn't even see her anymore. My mind was racing, my body trembling in sheer terror. But then, just when I thought the end was inevitable, there was a sound sharp, like the tearing of metal, and the world went black. The oppressive weight of the moment seemed to hang in the air, and I wondered if I had somehow imagined it all. Had the figure in the mirror, no, the thing been real? Or had the terror in my mind spun a tale too vivid to escape? But the air was still cold, biting with a chill that sank deep into my bones. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the weight on my chest lifted. I could breathe again. My body felt as though it had been held underwater, and now, finally, I was allowed to surface. The pressure was gone, the humming had stopped, and the world around me had gone eerily still. I blinked, trying to adjust to the dim light that was filtering through the cracks in the walls. The building groaned, as if it were alive, and I realized then that I was still standing, still alive. But where were the others? I twisted, my heart skipping a beat, and saw Clara and Ben standing a few feet away, their faces pale, their expressions filled with disbelief. They were shaken, no doubt, but they were alive. The horror that had nearly consumed us had passed, but it left behind something that felt even worse. a gnawing sense of confusion. The terror of the previous moments hadn't dissipated. If anything, it had multiplied, becoming something more sinister. Are we? Clara's voice trailed off, a hollow, distant sound. I shook my head, my own thoughts racing. We had to leave. Whatever had been happening in that place, whatever dark force had haunted us, was still out there. We couldn't stay any longer, not with the feeling of malice still hanging in the air. Come on, I said, my voice rough with the remnants of fear. We need to get out of here. I wasn't sure if it was instinct or desperation, but we moved together, quickly making our way back down the hallway. The eerie quiet had returned to the park, and for the first time, I allowed myself to believe we might actually make it out alive. As we rounded a corner, we saw it, the exit. The door, which had been warped and closed moments before, was now wide open, as though waiting for us. The air beyond the door felt like a distant memory, warm and comforting. The light outside, though dim, felt like a beacon of safety. We didn't hesitate. We rushed toward it, our feet pounding against the floor, the sound of our steps echoing through the hall. There was no turning back now. As we reached the threshold, I looked behind me, half expecting to see the shadows closing in, but there was nothing. The figure was gone. The whispers, the heavy presence that had been so close just moments ago, had vanished. I stepped outside first, feeling the cool night air wash over me. I took a deep breath, the clean air a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the park. The sense of dread had not fully lifted, but I knew we had escaped whatever hellish force had been hunting us. Clara followed close behind, her eyes wide with shock, her body trembling as she stepped into the open. Ben was the last to emerge, glancing nervously over his shoulder before hurrying out. We stood there for a long moment, just looking at the abandoned amusement park, the flickering lights casting strange shadows over the rusting rides. I tried to make sense of everything that had happened, but the pieces didn't fit. It was like trying to recall a nightmare, where nothing quite made sense, but the terror lingered long after waking. I turned to Ben, hoping for some kind of explanation, but he just shook his head. He looked as lost as I felt. Did that really happen? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. How could I? What had we just experienced? Was it the result of some strange collective hallucination, or had we truly encountered something beyond our understanding? All I knew for sure was that the park, that place of twisted memories and broken rides, was more than just a relic of a forgotten past. It was a thing with a mind of its own, something that could reach out and pull you into its grasp when you least expected it. We're alive, I said, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. But whatever happened in there, it's not over. Not really. Clara shook her head, as if trying to shake off the last remnants of the nightmare. No, I can't. I don't even want to think about it. I wanted to believe that we were free, that the nightmare was behind us, but deep down, I knew better. The park had given us an escape maybe, but there were too many unanswered questions. What had we truly encountered? And why was it that, even now, I felt the eerie sense that we were being watched, that something was still lurking just out of sight, waiting for us to turn around? Ben wiped his brow, his hands shaking. I don't know what we saw in there, but I don't want to ever go back. Ever. I nodded, agreeing with him. It wasn't just the horrors we'd experienced. It was the feeling that we hadn't truly escaped. That park had a hold on us now, and even though we were miles away from it, I couldn't shake the nagging sense that it would follow us, no matter how far we ran. We made our way to the car, the heavy silence of the night weighing down on us. The world outside the park seemed so normal, so peaceful, but I couldn't forget what had happened. I couldn't forget the feeling of being hunted, of being trapped in a place where the rules of reality didn't apply. As I climbed into the driver's seat, I looked out the window one last time at the amusement park, now silent in the distance. The lights flickered again, almost as if acknowledging our departure. And then, just as I was about to pull away, I saw something that made my heart race. A figure standing at the edge of the park, silhouetted against the dim light. Tall, shadowy, It stood perfectly still, its form indistinct but undeniable, and as I stared at it, I could almost feel its gaze locking onto mine, a silent warning in its presence. I slammed the car into drive, my foot pressing the pedal harder than I intended. The tires squealed against the asphalt as I sped away, not daring to look back. We were free, for now. But whatever we had awakened in that park, it wasn't finished with us. Not yet. As we drove away from the park, I couldn't shake the images that had been seared into my mind. The haunted ride, the endless corridors, the feeling of being watched, it all felt like a waking nightmare that refused to let go. Despite the warm air blowing in through the cracked windows, a chill still clung to my skin. It wasn't just the fear of what we'd seen, it was something deeper, something that told me that the evil we'd encountered hadn't just disappeared. It was out there, somewhere, waiting. Ben's hands were gripping the seat, his knuckles white. Clara sat beside me, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, her silence louder than any words could have been. None of us were speaking, and the car hummed along the empty streets like a low, mournful song. The further we got from the park, the more I wanted to believe that it was over, that the events of that night were nothing but a twisted experience we would look back on as a cautionary tale. But deep down, I knew that the park had left its mark on us. The sense of dread still lingered, hovering over us like a shadow that we couldn't escape. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, a figure, a shape, but the road behind us was as empty as the night itself. It was as though the entire world had been swallowed up by the darkness. But still, I felt it, the presence, the feeling of something there, something that was still following us, even now. Clara broke the silence, her voice strained and weak. Are we safe? I didn't have an answer. How could I? There was no certainty in a world where such things existed. How could we have been so blind, thinking that an abandoned amusement park was just a place to explore? We had underestimated the power of the place, its ability to reach into the depths of our minds and drag us into its nightmare. I don't know, I said finally, my voice rough. I don't think we'll ever be the same again. Ben nodded, his eyes downcast. There's something wrong with that place. Something unnatural. It's like it feeds off fear. That thought sent a fresh wave of terror through me. I had thought about the events from a logical standpoint, what had happened, how we'd managed to escape. But now, hearing it out loud, the reality of it hit me. The park didn't just trap people physically, it preyed on their fear, turning their minds into the very playground it thrived on. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered if the park had been aware of us long before we ever entered. What if it had been waiting for us, like a predator lying in wait for its prey? The idea that something so malevolent could exist, hidden in plain sight, was enough to make my skin crawl. I could still see that dark shape standing by the park entrance, its unmoving silhouette burning into my memory. I couldn't shake the image of those empty, hollow eyes that I swore I had seen just before we ran. Was it one of the lost souls who had been consumed by the park, or something worse? I didn't know, and the not knowing was what terrified me the most. Do you think anyone else will go there? Clara asked quietly. I swallowed, my throat dry. I had no idea. The park had been a place of childhood nostalgia for many people who used to bring their families, their children to ride the Ferris wheel and play carnival games. But now it was something entirely different. I looked out the window, the scenery blurring by as we drove through the empty streets. The whole town felt different too. There was something unnatural about the silence that had taken over, a sense that we were no longer part of the world we had known. As if, by stepping into that cursed place, we had crossed into something else, something dark and terrifying. I don't think anyone should go near that place again, I said, my voice firm, though my insides twisted with uncertainty. I think it wants something from us. Ben's gaze locked onto mine in the rearview mirror, and I saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. We had come to the same conclusion, whether we liked it or not. The park had claimed us, and in some way, we would always be tied to it. No matter how far we ran, no matter how much time passed. I knew that the feeling of it, that malevolent presence, would never truly leave us. As we neared the edge of town, I made a decision. The park couldn't be left to claim more victims. No matter how much we wished to forget, we couldn't just walk away from what had happened. What was happening? There were too many unanswered questions, too many signs that we hadn't fully escaped. We need to tell someone, I said finally, breaking the silence. We need to make sure no one else goes in there. Ben hesitated, but then nodded. You're right. No one should ever have to go through that. But deep down, I wondered if telling anyone would matter. The park had already shown us how powerful it could be. What if no one believed us? What if, in trying to warn the world, we only made it worse? The more I thought about it, the more I feared that the park would never allow us to walk away untouched. It wasn't just a place, it was something alive, something far beyond the reaches of our understanding. As we pulled into my driveway, I took a deep breath, hoping to shake off the feeling that something was still following us. The park was far behind us now, but I could feel its presence in my bones, in the way the air still felt too thick, too heavy. We said our goodbyes in hushed tones, each of us heading into the safety of our homes. But even as I walked up to my front door, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was still out there. Watching, waiting. The park was never truly gone, and neither were the horrors it had left behind. I locked the door behind me, feeling a faint sense of relief. But as I climbed into bed, my mind kept racing. Would we be okay? Or would that evil presence find its way back to us, one day, when we least expected it? As the night crept on, I heard the faintest sound, a creak, followed by a soft whisper. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest as I turned to look around the room. But there was nothing, just the sound of the wind tapping at the windows. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that the park was still out there, and that it had only just begun. I grew up in a small town, not too far from where I live now, and spent most of my life surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of everyday life. Nothing ever felt out of the ordinary. But that all changed one evening when I found myself on a road I'd never really paid much attention to before. It wasn't a major road, just an old, winding route that ran through the woods. Most people in town avoided it at night, for reasons I didn't understand at the time. It wasn't like it was particularly treacherous or anything. It was just eerie. Maybe it was the thick trees that lined both sides, or the way the road twisted like some kind of maze. Still, I never thought much about it until the night I took that turn. That night, it was just me and a couple of my friends. We were heading back from a late-night road trip, our usual hangout after a long week of work. The plan was simple: drive through the town, grab some fast food, and head home. Nothing special, nothing out of the ordinary. But something about the air felt different that night, like the kind of chill that lingers in your bones. It was an ordinary Friday evening, and yet, there was something about it that felt off, even before we got to the road. We were a group of four: me, Will, and two others whose names aren't important. It's not because they weren't important to me, they were, but because their roles in this story are minimal. It's what happened to me that night that matters. The car we were driving wasn't anything special. It was an old, beat-up sedan, the kind that had been around for years, but never quite gave up on life. We had been driving for hours, talking about everything and nothing, passing the time with casual conversation and laughter. I remember the sound of the tires rolling over the pavement, the hum of the engine, and the occasional flicker of the headlights. The night was quiet, almost too quiet. We were nearing the outskirts of town, heading toward the stretch of road I had mentioned earlier. I had never been one to believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but I always had a slight discomfort whenever I passed this road at night. Still, it wasn't anything that ever kept me awake at night or filled me with any real fear. Will, sitting in the passenger seat, pointed out the window as we approached the fork in the road that led to the old route. "Hey, you guys ever taken this road at night?" he asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and something else I couldn't quite place. "Nope," I replied, glancing at the narrow path that curved into the dark trees. "I've always avoided it. Something about it feels off." Will shrugged. "It's not that bad. Just a few turns and you're back on the main road." I looked out the window at the trees, their long shadows stretching across the pavement. The road didn't look dangerous, but there was something unsettling about it. Maybe it was the fact that it seemed so isolated, like the world outside didn't exist. No streetlights, no houses, just endless darkness on either side. But I shrugged it off. After all, it was just a road. What harm could it possibly do? The others were silent for a moment. Then one of them, I think it was Luke, spoke up. "You're not seriously scared, are you?" I could hear the teasing tone in his voice, and I could feel the pressure to be the brave one, the one who didn't let silly things like fear control me. So I did what any self-respecting person would do in that situation. I hit the gas and turned onto the road. It was just past midnight when we made the turn, the headlights cutting through the dense blackness like a knife. The car's engine hummed steadily, but the air around us felt heavier, like we were entering a place that didn't belong to the world of the living. The trees closed in around us, their branches swaying slightly in the wind. It wasn't a strong breeze, but there was something about the way they moved, slow and deliberate, that made me uneasy. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound being the tires rolling over the uneven surface. The road was narrow, winding, with sharp turns that made it hard to see what lay ahead. I could feel my grip tightening on the steering wheel, my eyes flicking from side to side as I tried to make out shapes in the darkness. At some point, we all fell quiet, the atmosphere in the car shifting from playful to tense. There was no particular reason for it. It was just that the night felt too still, too quiet. There was something in the air that made me want to hurry up and get off this road, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to be the one to admit I was spooked. But then, just as I was beginning to convince myself that everything was fine, I saw something in the distance. A flicker of movement. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then it happened again, something dark crossing the road, too fast for me to identify. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. "Did you see that?" Will's voice was sharp, filled with alarm. "Yeah," I said, my voice a little shaky. "What was that?" We all stared ahead into the darkness, but whatever it was gone. The road was empty, just the trees and the occasional gust of wind. My mind raced, trying to explain it away. Maybe it was an animal, some kind of large animal moving too quickly to catch in the headlights. "Let's just keep going," I muttered, my foot still pressing the gas, but now with a little more urgency. But no one spoke after that. The mood in the car had shifted, the tension hanging thick in the air. Even though the road ahead seemed perfectly normal, the fear that gripped me wouldn't let go. The trees, the darkness, it all felt so oppressive. And that's when I realized it wasn't the road itself that was the problem. The night seemed to stretch on forever. We didn't speak much in the car as I kept my hands tight on the steering wheel, my knuckles white from the tension. The road ahead appeared to go on endlessly, winding and twisting as if it didn't want to let us leave. The air inside the car grew stifling. Despite the windows being cracked, it felt thick, suffocating, as if the weight of the surrounding forest was closing in on us. The only noise was the low hum of the engine and the occasional groan of the tires as they rolled over the cracked asphalt. The car felt too small, too fragile in the midst of all that darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Something that had been there, hiding just beyond our reach, and it wasn't going to let us leave easily. Every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, something darting between the trees, just out of sight. But when I looked again, there was nothing there. No figure, no shape, just the dark, endless expanse of trees stretching into the night. The feeling of being watched didn't leave, though. It lingered in my chest, cold and heavy, like a weight pressing down on me. The others were silent. I couldn't even hear them breathing. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for me to do something, to make sense of all this. But I couldn't. There was no sense to be made. The world had shifted in that moment when we first saw that thing on the side of the road. Nothing felt real anymore. Suddenly, I heard it, a sharp scratching noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the trees brushing against the car. But no, it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It sounded like something was tapping on the window, clawing at the glass. I froze. My hands tightened on the wheel, my foot lifting off the gas pedal as the car slowed. I couldn't bring myself to look at the window. I could feel my heart pounding, beating so loudly that it drowned out every other sound. The others were still silent, their eyes wide with fear, their bodies rigid. "Did you hear that?" Will finally whispered, his voice tight with dread. I nodded without speaking. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees. Something was out there. The sound came again, scratching, scraping, like fingers dragging across glass. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced at the rearview mirror, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever it was, but the reflection was only dark trees and shadows. Then, the scratching stopped. For a moment, everything was eerily quiet. The car rolled forward again, but the silence between us all was deafening. I could feel the tension growing, thick and heavy, like a storm cloud ready to burst. "Let's stop the car," Luke said suddenly, his voice barely audible, but insistent. "What?" I asked, my eyes flicking to him in confusion. "Let's stop. We need to figure out what's happening," Luke said, his face pale but determined. "Something's out there, and we're not getting any answers by just driving around." There was a long pause, the weight of his words hanging in the air. He was right, but part of me didn't want to stop. I felt like if we stopped, if we got out of the car, we might never get back in. But we couldn't keep driving aimlessly forever. So, reluctantly, I pulled over to the side of the road, the tires crunching against the gravel. The moment the car came to a halt, I felt the temperature drop. It was as if the air itself had gotten colder, heavier. The silence around us was suffocating. "Let's get out," Will said, his voice trembling. "We need to see what's going on." I didn't want to, but the curiosity gnawed at me. The others seemed to feel the same way, their bodies tense, their eyes scanning the woods around us. After a few moments, we all opened the doors at once, stepping out into the cold night air. The moment my feet hit the ground, I felt it. The pressure in the air, the sense of something lurking just out of reach. It was as if the very trees themselves were alive, watching us, waiting. The forest was so still, so silent, that it felt unnatural. The leaves weren't rustling, the branches weren't creaking, they were motionless, as though holding their breath. I tried to shake the feeling of dread that settled over me like a heavy blanket. We moved cautiously, our eyes scanning every shadow, every rustle of leaves, but there was nothing. Only the sound of our breathing and the occasional creak of the trees, which seemed to grow louder in the stillness. Will led the way, moving toward the edge of the road, where the trees met the forest. He stopped suddenly, his body stiffening. We followed his gaze, but there was nothing there, no figure, no sign of movement. Only the dark void of the woods. "I swear I saw something," Will murmured, his voice strained. Something was watching us. We all nodded, even though we hadn't seen anything ourselves. It was as if the woods themselves had a presence, something ancient, something that didn't want us here. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. "Let's keep moving," Luke said, his voice quiet but firm. "We need to find out what's causing all of this." We started walking deeper into the woods, our steps slow and deliberate. The trees seemed to close in around us, their trunks thick and dark, their branches reaching out like twisted hands. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the silence became. It felt as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Then I heard it again, the soft scratching noise, the same as before. It was coming from behind us, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. "What was that?" Luke asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The fear had clamped down on me, paralyzing me with its intensity. I tried to listen for anything else, anything that might explain what was happening, but all I could hear was the steady beat of my heart, my breath too loud in my ears. The sound came again, louder this time, closer. Suddenly, something moved in the trees just beyond the reach of the dim light from the car. A shape, something dark and tall, shifting between the trunks. It wasn't a person, not exactly. The figure was too tall, too thin, its body stretching unnaturally toward the sky. "Get back to the car," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Now." Without waiting for a response, I turned and ran. The others followed suit, their feet pounding against the forest floor. We didn't look back, but the feeling of being pursued, of something following us, pressed down on us like a weight. I could feel the air getting colder, the darkness swallowing us whole, and I knew then that whatever had been watching us was not done yet. We reached the car in a panic, slamming the doors behind us. I could barely breathe as I started the engine, my hands shaking as I shifted into drive. The headlights cut through the trees, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, something that wasn't ready to let us go. The trees blurred past us as I sped down the road, the darkness pressing in from all sides. And somewhere behind us, I knew something was still following us, waiting for the right moment to strike. The car felt like a fragile barrier between us and whatever was lurking in the woods. The road ahead seemed endless, stretching into an abyss that had no end, no escape. The tires of the car hummed against the cracked pavement, but the noise only seemed to amplify the heavy silence that surrounded us. The fear that had settled in my chest since we'd first seen that thing, the shape in the trees, had only grown. It gnawed at my insides, threatening to tear me apart from the inside out. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see something or someone right behind us. But all I saw was blackness. The forest, looming close on either side, felt like it was closing in, trapping us in its cold, unyielding grip. "Why are we still driving?" Will's voice broke through the silence, his words sharp, strained with fear. "It's not going to let us leave." His words echoed in my mind. I couldn't argue with him. It wasn't letting us leave. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going to let us escape that easily. The woods felt alive now, alive with something ancient, something malevolent. The wind picked up again, a sudden gust that made the trees groan as if they were alive, as if they were whispering secrets we weren't meant to hear. I glanced over at Luke, who sat next to me, his knuckles white as he gripped the door handle. He hadn't spoken since we'd gotten back in the car, but I could see the fear in his eyes, the terror that mirrored my own. We all felt at this sense that we were being hunted, that whatever had been watching us was closing in, getting closer and closer with every passing second. Then, without warning, the car suddenly lurched, the engine sputtering as if something had seized up. My heart skipped a beat, and panic flooded through me as I desperately tried to restart the car. But it was no use, the engine refused to turn over. We were stuck. "No, no, no, no," I shouted, banging my fist against the steering wheel in frustration. "Not now." "Something's wrong," Luke said quietly, his voice trembling with the same fear I felt. "We're not alone anymore." His words chilled me to the bone. I could feel the pressure in the air, the oppressive weight of something watching us. The trees surrounding us swayed unnaturally, and the wind, once a gentle breeze, now howled with a strange, guttural tone, almost like a warning. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves, the soft scratching of branches against the car, as though something was deliberately trying to get inside. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my panic in check. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice hoarse with fear. "We need to get out of here." But before anyone could respond, there was a loud bang against the side of the car, followed by a heavy thud. My heart leaped into my throat as I whipped my head to the side, my eyes wide with terror. Then, a shape appeared in the distance. It was tall, impossibly tall, its silhouette standing out against the pitch-black night, like a dark shadow cast by something beyond our comprehension. It moved with an eerie fluidity, its limbs unnaturally long, its body stretched and distorted as if it didn't belong to this world. I froze, my breath caught in my chest, my body rigid with fear. It was coming for us. "Get out. Now," Will screamed, his voice high-pitched with panic. I didn't need any more encouragement. My hands trembled as I grabbed the door handle, yanking it open and stumbling out into the cold night air. The others followed, but none of us dared to look back. We just ran. The trees seemed to close in around us, their gnarled branches twisting above us like skeletal hands, reaching for us. The ground beneath our feet was uneven, rocks and roots tripping us up as we tried to move faster. But no matter how fast we ran, the thing behind us was always there, just out of sight, just beyond our reach. I could hear its footsteps now, heavy and deliberate, thudding against the ground like the beat of a drum. And then we heard it, a voice. Low, guttural, but unmistakable. It was as if the earth itself was speaking, as if the forest had come alive to call out to us. "Leave, leave, leave." The voice rumbled, sending a cold shiver down my spine. We didn't stop to figure out what it meant. We couldn't. Our bodies were moving on pure instinct now, fear pushing us forward, away from whatever had come for us. But just as we reached the edge of the woods, something grabbed me. Cold hands, fingers like iron, clamped around my ankle, pulling me back into the darkness. I screamed, my heart pounding in my chest as I fought to free myself. I kicked and struggled, but it was no use. Whatever had me wasn't letting go. "Help! Help me!" I screamed, my voice hoarse with panic. Luke and Will turned around, their faces stricken with terror. They ran toward me, but as they did, the air around us seemed to change. The world around us distorted, like a terrible mirage. The trees stretched and warped, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to mock us. The ground beneath us shifted, as though it was alive, trying to swallow us whole. I felt the pull of something deep beneath the earth, something cold and ancient, dragging me toward the ground. The fingers around my ankle were like ice, their grip unyielding. And then I saw it, the creature. It was standing in front of me now, towering over me, its form so massive that it blocked out the sky. Its face was a twisted mask of darkness, its eyes glowing faintly with a sickly green light. Its mouth was a jagged slit, filled with rows of sharp, jagged teeth. And in its eyes, I saw nothing but hunger, an insatiable hunger for something, something I couldn't even comprehend. I screamed again, but the sound was swallowed by the creature's low growl, its mouth opening wide as it moved closer. I could feel its breath, hot and fetid, brushing against my face. "Run!" Luke shouted, his voice filled with desperation. But it was too late. The creature was upon me. Its hand shot out, long fingers wrapping around my throat, squeezing tightly. I gasped for air, my vision blurring as I struggled against its grip. My body was numb with terror, unable to move, unable to fight back. Just when I thought I was going to pass out, the pressure suddenly lifted. I felt myself being pulled away from the creature's grasp, my body crashing into the ground. I looked up and saw Will, his face pale and wide-eyed with terror, pulling me toward him. "We need to go," he shouted. Now, but I couldn't move. I could only stare up at the creature, its eyes still locked on me. And then, as if it had lost interest, it turned away, disappearing into the trees, its massive form swallowed up by the shadows. I lay there for a moment, panting, my heart still racing in my chest. I could barely comprehend what had just happened. The creature was gone, but the terror lingered, clinging to me like a second skin. The forest felt alive again, but now it was silent, dead silent, as if the life had been sucked out of it. "We need to leave," I whispered hoarsely, barely able to speak. "We need to leave. Now." Without waiting for an answer, I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaky beneath me. The others followed, but I could feel it, whatever had been watching us. Whatever had come for us, it was still out there, waiting. It wasn't done with us. Not yet. We didn't stop running until we reached the first sign of civilization, an old gas station, its flickering lights offering a faint sense of security in the otherwise desolate landscape. The night had stretched on far longer than we could have imagined, and by the time we reached that station, every ounce of energy had been drained from our bodies. Our breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, and my legs felt like they were made of lead. I could barely focus, my thoughts a muddled mess, spinning in a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The terror of what we'd just faced still clung to me, suffocating, even as we finally stumbled into the safety of artificial light. We collapsed in front of the gas station, our bodies trembling, every muscle screaming in exhaustion. None of us spoke for a long time, our minds too clouded with shock to form coherent thoughts. There was no immediate sense of relief, just a quiet, overwhelming silence that hung between us. Will was the first to break the silence, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. What the hell was that? His words hung in the air, a question we all had, but no one had the answer to. Luke sat on the ground, his knees drawn up to his chest, his face pale and wide-eyed. He looked like a man who had seen something he wasn't meant to see. His eyes darted around the parking lot, as if the creature would appear at any moment. "I don't know," he muttered, his voice shaky. "I don't know, but I don't think we're safe yet." That thing, it wasn't just after us. It was after something else, something older, something much worse. The words hit me like a ton of bricks. I'd known it too. Even as I had tried to push the memory out of my mind, the sense that we weren't just random victims haunted me. There was a reason we had been chosen. There was a reason we had stumbled upon that road, and whatever had been watching us. It wasn't done. But what are we supposed to do now? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. We can't just keep running forever. We all knew the answer. We couldn't go back, not to that road. Not after what had happened. But we couldn't stay here either. The terror we'd experienced was far too fresh, and yet we were beginning to realize it wasn't over. The creature, the thing in the trees, the malevolent force that had hunted us was still out there. It had let us go, but not without a price. The thought gnawed at me, picking at the edges of my sanity. We couldn't escape it. We couldn't outrun it, but we could hide for now. I looked at the gas station, its dim lights casting long shadows across the empty lot. For the first time, I noticed the darkness creeping in again, the way it seemed to stretch outward, like something was feeding off the empty space, waiting to fill it with something unspeakable. We should leave, I finally said. My voice sounded strange, almost foreign, like it didn't belong to me. We need to find a way to get out of here. But where would we go? I didn't have an answer, and I knew none of us did. We could run and hide, but we couldn't outrun whatever had followed us. It was clear now that it wasn't just some freak accident or coincidence that had brought us here. No, this was something intentional, something purposeful. I couldn't shake the thought of the forest, its twisted trees, and that terrible thing watching us from the shadows. The sound of its low growl echoed in my mind. The cold breath against my face, the unrelenting grip it had on me. It hadn't killed us, but it had marked us, and I couldn't stop thinking about the way it had stared at me, like it knew something about me, something about all of us. I'm not going back to that road, Luke finally said, his voice full of raw emotion. Whatever that thing was, it's not gone. It's out there, and it's waiting for us to make a mistake. I nodded, not needing to say anything. I couldn't bring myself to argue with him. The fear was still there, gnawing at me, twisting inside. We couldn't go back. But where could we go? Let's just stay here for a while, Will said, his voice trembling. We need to rest, figure things out. Then we can think about what comes next. None of us objected. The decision was made, but there was no real comfort in it. It wasn't about finding peace. It was about survival, about holding on to whatever little bit of sanity we had left. The gas station was small, and the attendant, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and a quiet, unsettling demeanor, gave us a brief, almost indifferent glance as we walked in. He didn't ask questions, just gave us a nod before disappearing into the back. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights above us felt almost like a mockery, as though the mundane noise was attempting to drown out the echo of the horror we had just faced. As we sat down at one of the plastic tables, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. It felt unreal, like we had entered another world, one where logic and reason no longer applied. We had left the real world behind the moment we turned onto that cursed road, and there was no going back to the way things had been before. We had crossed the line, and there was no way to erase the mark it had left on us. Will spoke again, his voice distant. "Do you think we'll ever be able to forget what happened? Or is this something that stays with you forever?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. None of us knew the answer. We couldn't even begin to understand it. It was as though the very fabric of reality had torn open, and we had glimpsed something behind it, a darkness too deep, too ancient to comprehend. I glanced out the window, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched, but it was no use. The woods, the trees, everything out there seemed to be watching, waiting, as if it knew that we were vulnerable. We were far from safe, and I knew that, deep down, we would never truly escape whatever had followed us from that haunted road. As the hours passed, we managed to calm ourselves, at least enough to speak again. But it wasn't the same. None of us could pretend we were unaffected. The horror we'd seen, the terror that had gripped us, had changed us. We weren't the same people who had set out on this trip. We were survivors, but at what cost? What had we lost in that forest? Was it just our minds, or had we lost something deeper, something intangible, but no less real? And as the night wore on, we couldn't help but feel that we hadn't seen the last of whatever haunted that road. Whatever it was, it had touched us. It's been months since that night, months since we escaped that road and its horrors. Yet, no matter how hard I try to convince myself that it's over, that the nightmare is behind us, I can't shake the feeling that something isn't quite right. Something changed within me that night, something I can't explain, and I'm not the only one. I haven't spoken to Luke or Will since we left that gas station. We all went our separate ways, but the connection we shared, the shared trauma that bound us together, remained. We had all come to realize something. The road wasn't just a place. It was a portal, a doorway to something we were never meant to understand. And no matter how much we wanted to forget, we couldn't. The memories haunted us, creeping in at the quietest moments when we least expected it. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I can almost hear the faintest sound like a low growl, distant but unmistakable. It's a sound that haunts my dreams, that sneaks into my thoughts when I least want it. But no one else hears it. They don't understand. I don't know why I can't let go. I should be thankful that we got away, that we survived. But a part of me knows that whatever we encountered on that road, it's still out there. It never truly left us. As I sit here writing this, in the dim light of my room, I can't help but think back to the final moments of that night. When we were at the gas station, sitting in the sterile light, trying to pretend we were safe, I remember that feeling, the one I couldn't shake. Even in the so-called safety of the station, the shadows outside seemed to stretch impossibly long. And there, just out of sight, beyond the parking lot, I saw something, a movement, almost imperceptible, like something watching, waiting. I tried to ignore it, but deep down, I knew it was still out there. We tried to move on with our lives after that night, but it never felt the same. For a while, we went back to our daily routines. I went back to work, met with friends, tried to return to the life I had known. But it was different. I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the world I had known was no longer the same. I couldn't ignore the lingering thought that we had glimpsed something beyond our comprehension, something that had marked us. I did try to reach out to Will and Luke, but every time I picked up the phone, something held me back. I knew that we couldn't go back to how things were before. What had happened between us wasn't just a bad memory. It was an understanding. We shared something now, something that bound us together in a way that words could never explain. But there was something else too. A fear. A fear that we had all seen too much, felt too much, and that no matter how far we tried to run, we'd never truly be free from it. One night, I drove past the place where that road had been. I didn't plan to go there, not consciously. It was an accident. I had been driving aimlessly, trying to clear my head, and I found myself there. The fog rolled in just like it had on that night, thick and suffocating. I couldn't see much beyond the edges of the headlights, but I could feel it. That pull, that dread. I stopped the car at the side of the road, unable to bring myself to go any further. The place seemed different now, emptier, colder. I don't know how long I stayed there, sitting in the stillness, but eventually I forced myself to drive away. I couldn't help but feel that the road was still there, stretching on, waiting for me to return. And so, here I am, still haunted. The memory of that night lingers, a shadow that follows me wherever I go. I've tried to tell myself it was just a dream, just an illusion, a trick my mind played on me. But deep down, I know better. The road wasn't just a place. It was something ancient, something darker than anything I could ever understand. And I've come to realize that whatever was watching us that night, it never truly left. It's still out there, still waiting. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear a sound. A rustle in the trees, a low growl in the distance. It's almost as if the earth itself is calling to me, pulling me back to that place where I was marked, where I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. And I wonder, will it ever stop? Will I ever truly be free? I wish I could say I'm fine, that everything's okay. But I know that's not the case. I know that I'll never be the same again. Maybe none of us will. So, I leave you with this, a warning of sorts. If you ever find yourself near a road like the one I walked, a road that feels too quiet, too empty, don't take the chance. Don't turn down that path. Because whatever's waiting for you there, whatever you'll find, is more than just a nightmare. It's real, and it will follow you, even when you think you've escaped. Maybe you can outrun the fear for a little while, but eventually it will catch up with you. And when it does, you'll wish you had never ventured down that road at all. It was supposed to be an ordinary weekend camping trip. Just me, the wilderness, and the calm embrace of nature. After months of hectic work and the constant hum of city life, I needed this retreat. I needed the silence, the quiet, unspoiled air of the forest. It had been a long time since I felt truly alone in such an expansive, undisturbed place. My plan was simple. Head out early Friday morning, hike through the woods to a secluded spot near a small isolated lake, set up camp, and enjoy a few peaceful days. No distractions, no phone service, just me and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just a break from the grind. It was an early autumn afternoon when I arrived. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden light across the forest floor. The air smelled fresh and earthy. I parked my truck near the trailhead and began my trek. The trail was narrow, winding through dense pines and thick underbrush. The sound of crunching leaves beneath my boots and the distant call of birds were the only noises that filled the silence. At first, everything felt like it was supposed to. It felt right. As I continued on, I recalled the countless camping trips I'd been on over the years, each one with different people, in different places. But this one felt different. There was something about the way the trees seemed to tower just a little taller here, the way the shadows lingered just a little too long. But I brushed it off. It was just the isolation, nothing more. After about 2 hours of hiking, I reached the spot I had picked out, a small clearing just off the trail, tucked away in a quiet part of the forest. The trees opened up to reveal a picturesque lake, the water reflecting the fading daylight. It was perfect. I set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and started a small fire. It felt good to be away from everything: work, people, the noise of the world. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that seemed to matter. As the evening progressed, I began to feel an odd sense of peace. Nothing felt wrong, not yet. Just the world, the fire, and me. I cooked myself a simple dinner, nothing fancy, just some canned beans and rice, but it tasted like a feast. I thought about how, in moments like these, you find yourself reflecting on the little things, the small joys that get buried under the weight of everyday life. The feeling of warmth from the fire, the smell of fresh pine, the way the stars began to emerge as darkness fell. Everything was exactly how it should be. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped significantly. The forest seemed to become quieter, almost too quiet. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to distract myself from the growing chill. That was when I first noticed it, the faint rustling in the bushes at the edge of the clearing. My eyes flicked toward the noise, expecting to see an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But there was nothing, just the dark outlines of the trees, still and silent. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably just the wind or some small animal passing by. The night wore on, and the sound of the forest gradually became more pronounced, the occasional snap of a twig in the distance, the rustling of leaves, the far-off hoot of an owl. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and stretched out on the ground near the fire. There was no sense of danger, no real reason to feel anything but calm. But the air, it felt a little thicker, a little heavier. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something in the atmosphere felt off, like I wasn't truly alone, despite the miles of wilderness surrounding me. As the hours stretched on, I finally decided it was time for bed. The fire was dying down, the embers glowing faintly, and the cold had crept into my bones. I crawled into my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and zipped myself up. But sleep didn't come as easily as it usually did on these trips. The sense that something wasn't quite right still lingered, like a faint echo in the back of my mind. I tried to shake it off, tried to tell myself it was just the isolation getting to me. But then came the second noise, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching through the dry leaves just outside my tent. I froze. Who else could be out here? I wasn't near any major trails. The area was isolated. There was no reason for anyone to be this deep in the forest, especially at night. My heart started to race, my breath quickening in my chest. I wanted to call out, to shout and demand to know who was there. But I stayed quiet, listening intently. The footsteps stopped. A heavy silence filled the air. I held my breath, waiting for any sign of movement, any sound that would tell me what was going on. But there was nothing. No movement, no further footsteps, just the same cold, eerie stillness. It was then that I knew something wasn't right, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. The night dragged on. I stayed awake, my ears straining for any hint of sound, but there was nothing else. By morning, I was still on edge, still unsure of what I had heard, what I had experienced. But there was no sign of anyone, no trace of the footsteps. The camp was as quiet as it had been before, as though the strange noises of the night had been a figment of my imagination. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. So, with the daybreak came a sense of dread, as if the calmness of the previous hours had been nothing but an illusion. And that's when I started noticing the strange remnants around me, the things that didn't make sense. But I wasn't sure yet if I was ready to confront them. The morning after the strange footsteps, I awoke with a feeling of unease that I couldn't shake. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft glow through the trees and onto the ground outside my tent. Everything looked normal at first glance. Nothing seemed out of place, no signs of disturbance in the surrounding area. The forest was as quiet as it always was, except for the occasional rustle of wind through the leaves. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself that the sounds I had heard during the night were just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I was alone in the wilderness, far from the distractions and noise of the world. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me. I needed to get out of my head, to focus on the tasks at hand. I had planned this trip for weeks, and I wasn't going to let my imagination ruin it. I rolled out of my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cool morning air. The chill stung my skin, and I shivered as I stretched. The fire pit from the previous night was just a bed of smoldering embers, faintly glowing beneath a blanket of ashes. I knelt beside it and added a few more logs to get the fire going again. The crackle of the fresh wood helped settle my nerves, but the lingering sense that something was wrong still gnawed at me. As the fire began to burn, I took a moment to survey my surroundings. The campsite, though simple, had been set up meticulously. My tent was still standing, my pack resting nearby, my camping stove next to a pile of firewood. But that's when I noticed something strange, a half-eaten apple, its skin dark and withered, lying next to my backpack. It wasn't mine. I didn't bring any apples with me. And yet, there it was, clearly visible in the morning light. My first thought was that maybe an animal had left it there, a curious raccoon or squirrel. But the apple was too carefully placed. It wasn't knocked over or tossed aside like something an animal would have left. No, this apple had been deliberately placed next to my pack, almost as if someone had set it there for me to find. I stood there, staring at it for what felt like an eternity. My mind raced. Could someone else have been here? Someone else who had seen me set up camp, someone who had approached in the night? I quickly scanned the area, but there were no footprints, no sign of anyone else. It was just the same empty forest that I had walked into the day before. I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts swirling in my mind. It had to be a coincidence. There was no other explanation. Maybe a deer had nudged it closer to my tent, or some other animal had played a trick on me. I took a deep breath, picked up the apple, and tossed it into the fire. The crackling sound of it burning was oddly soothing, but I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was off. I moved on with my day, trying to focus on the mundane tasks, making breakfast, checking my gear, preparing for a hike around the lake. But the incident with the apple weighed heavily on me. It was the first time I had truly felt that sense of being watched, that eerie feeling that something wasn't quite right. I couldn't shake the image of the apple sitting there, waiting for me to find it. As the day wore on, things seemed to return to normal. The sun rose higher in the sky, the warmth creeping in with the light. I packed a small day bag with water, snacks, and a map, deciding to venture around the lake to see what else this secluded area had to offer. The water was still and calm, reflecting the trees and sky like a perfect mirror. I was beginning to feel like I had just been imagining things, that perhaps the solitude was making me overly sensitive. But then I found something else, something that would change everything. About an hour into my hike, I noticed something strange ahead of me. The trail led me toward the edge of the forest, where the trees thinned out into a more open area. As I approached, I saw a small, abandoned campsite. It wasn't much, just a fire ring, a few scattered pieces of gear, and a couple of empty water bottles. But what struck me as odd was how fresh it all looked. The fire ring still had some charred remnants of wood in it, as if someone had used it recently. A tent pole was leaning against a tree, and the remnants of a makeshift tarp were draped across the ground. It looked as though someone had left in a hurry. I paused, my heart starting to race again. I had walked for hours and hadn't seen another soul. There was no way anyone else could have been out here without me noticing. The campsite shouldn't have been there. It didn't belong. It was out of place, like it had been left overnight, but never packed up. Whoever had been here had simply disappeared. I walked closer, my steps tentative. I knelt down near the fire ring and examined it more closely. The ashes were still warm to the touch, though not hot. That meant someone had been here within the last few hours. But where were they now? Why had they left everything behind? I stood up, scanning the area again, hoping to spot someone emerging from the trees, but the forest remained silent. My mind raced with possibilities. Was I being watched? Was someone toying with me, or was this some bizarre coincidence? I had no answers, only more questions. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I carefully stepped away from the campsite. I felt the familiar sensation of being watched again, but I couldn't pinpoint the source. The forest around me seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer, darker, as if the trees themselves were conspiring against me. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself that it was just a deserted camp. Maybe someone else had passed through, stopped for a night, and moved on. But the strangeness of it wouldn't leave my mind. I turned around and headed back toward my own campsite, my pace quickening as I retraced my steps. I couldn't wait to leave that strange spot behind. But as I neared my campsite, I froze. Something had changed. The fire pit I had left behind, still smoking when I had left, was now completely extinguished. The wood I had stacked neatly in the corner of the clearing was no longer there. And in the middle of the campsite, standing upright, was something I hadn't seen before. A wooden figure, crudely carved, with sharp, angular features. It was like nothing I had ever seen, a strange totem-like figure that looked as if it had been placed deliberately in my path. I walked up to it, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. It was carved from a single piece of wood, twisted and jagged, with unsettling markings etched into its surface. It wasn't just an odd decoration, it was a warning, something out of place, something that shouldn't have been here. I reached out to touch it, but as my fingers brushed against the rough wood, a chill ran down my spine. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps approaching from behind me. I whirled around, but there was no one there. I stood frozen, the figure in front of me and the footsteps behind me, my mind racing. It was no longer a question of whether I was alone. It was clear that I wasn't. But who was out there? And what did they want? I couldn't stay here any longer. The air around me grew thick with unease as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the forest. My heart raced with every step I took, the sense of being watched more pronounced with each passing moment. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, just beyond the tree line, observing me from the darkness. It wasn't the normal, quiet solitude of the wilderness anymore. It felt wrong, as if the forest itself had turned against me. I couldn't leave. My mind wouldn't let me. I had come here to find peace, to enjoy a few days of solitude and disconnect from the chaos of the world. But instead, I found myself trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. The strange totem figure, the abandoned campsite, and now the unmistakable sensation that someone or something was following me. I couldn't help but feel that everything was connected. But how? And why? After the strange totem appeared in my campsite, I took a deep breath and decided I needed answers. The logical part of me told me to remain calm, that it was just an odd series of coincidences. But my gut told me otherwise. Something was happening here, something beyond my understanding, and I was in the thick of it. The next morning, I gathered what little courage I had left and decided to return to the abandoned campsite I had stumbled upon the day before. It was the only clue I had, the only place where things didn't quite add up. As I packed my bag, the familiar feeling of dread settled deep in my chest, but I knew I had to go. I had to find out more. The hike back to the site was uneventful at first, the forest seeming quieter than usual. The chirping of birds had stopped entirely, replaced by a heavy silence that clung to the air. The ground beneath my boots felt unnervingly soft, like something was shifting beneath me with every step. The further I walked, the more the woods felt like a maze, the trees crowding in on me, their twisted branches resembling hands reaching out to grab me. When I arrived at the campsite, I stopped dead in my tracks. It wasn't how I had left it. The fire ring was still there, but the remnants of the scattered gear were now neatly arranged. The tarp that had once been draped haphazardly over the ground was folded into a perfect square. It was as if someone had come back, tidied up, and then disappeared again. The tin pole, which had been leaning against the tree, was now upright, firmly planted in the ground, as though waiting for someone to use it again. I felt a chill spread across my skin. This wasn't a place of abandonment anymore. It felt inhabited. But by whom? I approached the fire ring cautiously, my eyes scanning every corner of the campsite for any sign of life. As I knelt down, I noticed something strange in the ashes. It wasn't a piece of wood or a burnt stick, but a small, smooth rock, perfectly round, almost polished. It was unnervingly out of place among the charred remains. Without thinking, I picked it up, feeling the cool surface of the rock beneath my fingertips. There was something about it, something unsettling, as if it didn't belong. My mind raced. Could it be another clue? Who would leave something like this behind? And why? Suddenly, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. A faint sound, like a twig snapping underfoot, reached my ears from somewhere off in the woods. My body tensed, and I spun around, but the forest around me remained still. Not a leaf moved, not a branch swayed. I had heard something, there was no denying it, but I couldn't place where it had come from. I waited for several long minutes, my breath shallow, my pulse pounding in my ears. But nothing happened. No footsteps, no movement. Only the silence that seemed to smother everything. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the rock still in my hand. Should I stay and investigate further? Should I follow the noise? My instinct screamed at me to leave, to run back to my campsite and pack up, but I couldn't. Something was drawing me in, something I couldn't quite explain. Against my better judgment, I decided to venture deeper into the woods, following the faint sound that had startled me. It was a difficult decision, one driven by fear and curiosity in equal measure. As I made my way through the thick underbrush, the forest around me seemed to close in even more, the branches reaching out like hands, brushing against my skin, sending a jolt of discomfort through me. The deeper I went, the more the world around me seemed to distort. The shadows grew longer, darker, as if the very air was thickening, pressing down on me. Every step I took felt like a mistake, like I was trespassing in a place where I didn't belong. Then I saw it. A figure in the distance, standing completely still beneath the trees. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow playing tricks on my eyes. But no, it was a person. I could see the outline clearly now, tall, thin, with a hunched posture, and completely motionless. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't make out any features, only the silhouette of a person standing just beyond the trees, barely visible through the thick foliage. I wanted to call out, to ask if they were lost, but something stopped me. I couldn't move. It was as though the very air around me had grown heavier, pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. I wanted to turn around and run, but my feet were frozen to the ground. The figure remained still, not moving an inch, not acknowledging my presence. Then, without warning, the sound of footsteps echoed through the woods again, this time louder, closer. I jerked my head to the side, my eyes scanning the area. But once again, there was nothing. The footsteps stopped, as if someone or something had suddenly disappeared. I blinked and turned back toward the figure, only to find it was gone. I felt my heart race. There was no way someone could have moved that quickly, not without making a sound. I scrambled back, my mind in a panic, the overwhelming feeling of being watched almost suffocating me. I didn't care anymore about the rock or the totem or the strange events I had encountered. All I wanted was to get out of there, to leave this place behind and never look back. But as I turned to flee, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice. A whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. Leave! I didn't hesitate. My legs carried me forward, faster than I thought possible, the sound of my breathing loud in my ears as I raced through the trees, the sensation of eyes on my back never letting up. By the time I returned to my campsite, I was trembling, my entire body shaking with fear. The forest around me was eerily quiet again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. Something had changed in the air, something that couldn't be explained. The events that had unfolded since I arrived had gone from strange to terrifying, and I knew deep down that I couldn't stay any longer. Something in this forest didn't want me here, and I was running out of time before it made its move. The morning came too soon. The sense of dread in the pit of my stomach hadn't lessened since the night before. The voice, the figure, the unnerving sensation of being followed, it all hung over me like a dark cloud. I had tried to shake off the fear, telling myself that maybe I was just overthinking things, that the wilderness was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever was out there wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was waiting. As I packed my gear in a hurry, trying to get everything together before the sun fully rose, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. The totem, the one I had found near the fire ring, was gone. At first, I thought I might have misplaced it in my panic, but when I retraced my steps, I realized that it was impossible. The totem had been placed carefully in the center of the campsite. It couldn't have simply vanished. The sense of unease in my chest grew with every passing minute. The woods had gone completely still. Not a bird chirped, not a leaf rustled. The only sound I could hear was the rapid beat of my heart, drowning out everything else. I couldn't stay any longer. I had to leave before whatever was lurking in the trees made itself known. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again, footsteps, faint at first, but unmistakable. They were soft, deliberate, as if someone was following me, but always staying just out of sight. I stopped in my tracks, my breath caught in my throat. I spun around, searching the woods, but saw nothing. Only the trees, the thick underbrush, and the growing shadows. I turned back toward the path, my body tense, my every step filled with dread. There was no question now. Someone or something was watching me, and it wasn't going to let me go that easily. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and I could feel the air around me grow colder, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me. I glanced over my shoulder again, but there was still no one in sight. I broke into a run, my feet pounding against the soft earth, my breath coming in sharp gasps. But with every step I took, I felt the presence behind me growing nearer, almost as if whatever was following me was mirroring my movements, staying right on my heels. Panic surged within me, and I ran faster, the trees blurring past me in my desperate flight. My legs burned with the effort, but I didn't dare slow down. Not now. I could hear it now, closer than ever, a low, guttural sound that almost resembled a growl, echoing through the trees. I stumbled, losing my footing on the uneven ground, but I forced myself to keep moving. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn around, to face whatever was behind me, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The fear had taken root deep within me, and my instincts were telling me that I had to keep running or risk being caught. Just as I thought I might collapse from exhaustion, I burst through the trees and found myself back at the edge of the clearing near the abandoned campsite. The familiar sight of the fire ring did nothing to calm my nerves. It felt wrong now, like a trap set just for me. The air was still, and for a moment, I thought I might have outrun whatever was chasing me. But then, as if on cue, I heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable. The same voice I had heard the day before, the one that had whispered in the trees. It spoke my name. Leave! My blood ran cold. The voice was closer this time, and it wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was clear, sharp, and full of something dark, something ancient. I spun around, my eyes scanning the area, but I saw nothing. And then I saw it. Emerging from the shadows of the trees, a figure stepped into the clearing. At first, I couldn't make out the details. It was too dark, too far away. But as it moved closer, the shape became clearer. It was tall, unnaturally so, its long limbs reaching out toward me like something out of a nightmare. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its face was hidden behind a mask of twisted, hollow eyes. It didn't walk like a person. It glided, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it didn't belong to this world. I froze, unable to move, unable to tear my gaze away from the figure. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could feel my body shaking, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I couldn't run. I couldn't scream. All I could do was watch in horror as the creature, no, the thing continued to approach. It stopped a few feet away from me, its hollow eyes boring into mine, and I felt the temperature drop even further, as if the air itself had turned to ice. A thick, oppressive silence enveloped us, the only sound the rapid pounding of my heart in my ears. And then it spoke. You shouldn't have come. Its voice wasn't human. It was low, guttural, and filled with a deep, unsettling resonance that sent a chill straight down my spine. Every hair on my body stood on end as its words echoed in the air, each syllable sending shockwaves of terror through my mind. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed. Why? I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. I was surprised I could even form words. The fear was overwhelming, suffocating me, but I had to know. I had to understand what was happening, what this thing wanted from me. The figure tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion, as if considering my question. Its mouth twisted into something that resembled a smile, but there was nothing friendly or human about it. It was twisted, cruel, as if the smile was carved into its face. Because you are not meant to be here, it replied, its voice dripping with malice. You trespassed where you shouldn't have. Now you will pay the price. I took a step back, my legs finally finding the strength to move, but I didn't get far. The creature raised one of its long, bony hands and pointed at me, its fingers stretching out like claws. A sudden, intense pressure surrounded me, as though the very air was being squeezed out of my lungs. I gasped, my breath caught in my throat, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't draw in enough air. The weight of the thing's gaze felt like a physical force, crushing me from all sides. You shouldn't have come, it repeated, its voice growing louder, more commanding, as if the words themselves had the power to break me. I struggled to breathe, my vision darkening around the edges. But then, just as suddenly as the pressure began, it stopped. The creature withdrew its hand, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. My heart was still racing, and my mind was spinning, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The thing was still standing there, watching me, its hollow eyes filled with something I couldn't describe, something ancient, something evil. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. I could barely think, my mind too rattled to process what I had just witnessed. Was this real? Had I lost my mind? I couldn't tell anymore. And then it was gone. In the blink of an eye, the creature vanished, melting into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. I was left alone in the clearing, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest around me had returned to its eerie silence, but the weight of what had just happened lingered, pressing down on me like a nightmare that wouldn't end. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what had just happened or why it had happened, but I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't stay here any longer. I grabbed my bag, my hands shaking, and ran. I ran. My feet pounded against the earth, my body screaming in protest. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. The image of that creature, its hollow eyes staring into mine, was burned into my mind. Every second I spent in that cursed forest felt like an eternity, and I knew that if I stayed any longer, I wouldn't leave at all. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get away. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing in from all sides, as if the wilderness itself was conspiring to trap me. But still, I ran. The sounds of the forest were deafening now, the crunch of leaves beneath my feet, the rustling of branches in the wind, the distant call of a bird, but they all felt distant, unreal, like they belonged to a different world. My mind was focused on one thing only: escape. As I made my way through the woods, I thought back to the moments that had led me to this point. The strange occurrences at the campsite, the unnerving feeling that I was being watched, the eerie whispers in the trees. It was all starting to make sense in a way, though I didn't want it to. There was something ancient in those woods, something old and dark, and I had stumbled right into its territory. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, whatever had been following me, wasn't done with me yet. But as I ran, a small part of me clung to hope. Maybe it was over. Maybe I had outrun whatever had been chasing me. But that hope was shattered when I saw the clearing ahead. It was the same clearing, the one with the abandoned campsite. The one where I had encountered the creature. My heart skipped a beat. No, this couldn't be happening. I stood frozen for a moment, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. How could I be back here? I had run in the opposite direction. I should have been miles away by now. But there it was, the campsite, the fire ring, the remnants of the totem, all of it. I turned around, looking back the way I had come. The path I had taken was gone, swallowed up by the dense trees and underbrush. It was as if the forest had shifted while I wasn't looking, as if it had changed its shape to bring me back here. My chest tightened. It didn't make sense. I couldn't explain it. And then, as if on cue, I heard it again. That voice. The one that had whispered in my ear, the one that had filled my nightmares. It spoke my name again, this time louder, more insistent.
Clave.
I whirled around, searching for the source, but there was nothing. Just the trees, the undergrowth, the fire ring that was now covered in ash. I could feel my legs giving way beneath me. The weight of everything, the fear, the exhaustion, the uncertainty, it was all crashing down on me at once. I had no idea what I was supposed to do. Should I run again? Should I stay and confront whatever was haunting me? But before I could make a decision, the ground beneath my feet shifted. I stumbled, falling to my knees as the earth seemed to tremble. The trees around me creaked and groaned, and I heard the unmistakable sound of something moving through the underbrush, something large, something unnatural. I looked up, my eyes wide with terror, and that's when I saw it. The figure. It was back. The creature that had haunted me. The same twisted, nightmarish shape, its long limbs stretching out toward me, its face hidden behind that mask of hollow eyes. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, just outside the reach of the firelight, and it was watching me again. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, my voice strangled by fear. I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I was paralyzed, frozen in place, as the creature slowly began to move toward me. But then something strange happened. The air around me began to shift. The temperature dropped even further, and I could feel a strange pressure building in my chest, like the weight of the world was pushing down on me. The creature halted, its hollow eyes turning toward the sky. For a moment, everything was silent. And then, in a flash, the creature was gone. Just like that, it melted into the shadows, disappearing without a trace. I blinked, trying to process what had just happened, but it made no sense. 1 second, the creature was right in front of me, and the next, it was gone. The silence was deafening. I stood there, still frozen, trying to make sense of it all. Had it all been a nightmare? Was I hallucinating from the exhaustion? No, I knew what I had seen. It was real. And whatever it was, it wasn't done with me yet. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaking beneath me, and I began to stumble away from the campsite. The path ahead was unclear, but I had to get out of there. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay. Not here. Not with that thing still lurking in the woods. I walked for what felt like hours, my mind reeling, my body numb. The woods seemed endless, the trees stretching out in every direction, and the sun had barely risen. The forest felt like it was closing in on me again, but this time I refused to look back. I couldn't. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I saw something in the distance, a sign of civilization. A road, a highway. It was faint, but it was enough to give me hope. I forced myself to move faster, my legs screaming in protest, until I finally emerged from the woods, breathless, terrified, and broken. I collapsed onto the side of the road, my heart racing, my mind spinning with the events that had unfolded. But even then, as I sat there, the sense of dread didn't fade. I could still feel the creature's presence, still hear that voice echoing in my mind. I had escaped the woods, but had I really escaped it? I glanced back at the forest, its dark silhouette looming in the distance, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. Whatever had happened in those woods, whatever I had encountered, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was far from over. And maybe, just maybe, it was waiting for me to return. But I wasn't going back. Not now. Not ever. I hadn't planned to stay in that town for long, but the events in the woods had changed something in me. What had started as a simple camping trip turned into something unexplainable, something that had shaken me to my core. The once familiar world around me felt distant, as though it was all just a mirage, fading in and out of focus. The terror I had experienced in the forest clung to me, weighing me down, never letting me forget. The local motel had a faded sign that blinked weakly in the morning light. It was cheap and run down, but it was a roof over my head. I hadn't spoken to anyone in the town except for the receptionist who checked me in, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and an aloof attitude. She hadn't asked any questions, but I saw the brief flicker of recognition when I mentioned the forest. I didn't dwell on it, though. I didn't need anyone to tell me what I had already known. There was something wrong with those woods, something ancient and unforgiving. I didn't sleep the first night in the motel. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature, its hollow eyes locked on me, its twisted limbs reaching for me. The sound of my own heartbeat felt too loud, too unnatural in the stillness of the room. I kept the lights on, staring at the ceiling until the pale light of dawn crept through the curtains. The next day, I tried to pretend everything was normal. I walked into the small town square, bought a coffee at a rundown diner, and sat by the window, watching the world pass by. It was as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't just survived something unexplainable, something that no one would ever believe. I was sitting there, sipping my coffee, when a man walked in. He had a rugged, weathered look to him, a sort of unshakable calmness in his eyes. He didn't look out of place in the small town, no one did, but there was something about him that felt different. I didn't know why I noticed him at first, but when he sat down at the counter, I heard him mumbling something under his breath. It was too low to make out, but the tone of his voice caught my attention. He sounded unsettled. I couldn't help but listen more closely. The woods. It's never been right. I froze. My coffee cup hovered near my lips as I strained to hear. The man didn't seem to notice me watching him. He was staring down at the counter, his hands gripping the edge like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. But I heard those words, the same ones I had been dreading to hear. The woods. It wasn't just me. I set the coffee cup down slowly and stood up. I didn't know why, but I felt the need to speak to him, to ask him if he had experienced what I had. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was the feeling that I wasn't truly alone in this. I walked up to him, my legs feeling heavier with each step. You know about the woods? I asked cautiously. He looked up at me, his eyes locking onto mine. There was no fear there, only a quiet understanding. "You went in, didn't you?" he said softly, almost as if it was an inevitability. I nodded, my throat tight. "What? What happened in there?" My voice faltered, the question feeling too big to ask, but I had to know. I couldn't carry this alone. The man leaned back, a long sigh escaping him. "It's hard to explain," he said, "but I'll try. That forest, it isn't just trees and dirt. There's something else, something older than us, something that doesn't belong here. People go in, they see things that shouldn't exist. Some come out, some don't, but none of them leave the same." I swallowed hard, trying to process his words. "You've been in there?" He gave a short, bitter laugh. "Once. A long time ago. But there's a price for that knowledge." He paused, eyes distant, as though lost in a memory. "I've been running from it ever since." I sat down next to him, unable to tear my eyes away. "Running from what?" "The woods." He shook his head slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's still here, you know. Watching. Waiting." I couldn't stop the chill that ran down my spine. It was as if the air around us had thickened, becoming heavier, suffocating. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "It's not over." "It can't be." He turned to me then, his gaze sharp, piercing. "It's never over. Not until it has what it wants." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "And it wants you." A knot formed in my stomach. My throat went dry as I tried to process what he was saying. "What do you mean?" I repeated, but I already knew. The answer was in his eyes. "The creature you saw," he began, his voice low. "It's not just a thing. It's part of the forest. It's not alive, not in the way you think. It's a part of the land itself. The land is cursed, and those who cross into it become part of that curse." I shook my head, disbelief and fear mixing in my chest. But I left. "I'm here. I'm safe. It can't reach me." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath, as though trying to gather his thoughts. "You think you've escaped," he said, his voice heavy. "But once you've seen it, once you felt its gaze, it doesn't let go. It follows. Always." I stood up abruptly, my heart pounding in my chest. "No," I said, shaking my head. "No, you're wrong. I'm not going back there. It's over." But as I turned to leave, I heard it again, the whisper, that same cold voice that had haunted me in the woods. I froze. The voice wasn't just in my head. It was there, in the air around me. I could feel its presence, could almost see the shadows stretch toward me. My body stiffened, every nerve screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. The man at the counter was looking at me with a knowing expression. "It's already too late," he said softly. I ran out of the diner, the door slamming behind me as I fled into the street. My legs were moving before my brain could catch up. I had to get out. I had to escape it, whatever it was. I had just wrapped up a long week of work and was looking forward to a quiet drive home from the office. The drive was usually nothing to worry about, just an ordinary route through quiet suburban streets. But something happened that night. Something I couldn't quite explain, even now. Let me start from the beginning. I was driving alone, as usual. I had always preferred solitude when I was on the road. No distractions, no conversation. Just me and my thoughts, with the hum of the engine in the background. I had recently started using a new GPS app on my phone after hearing some rave reviews. It was supposed to be faster, more efficient, and more accurate than anything I had used before. I had no reason to doubt it. I trusted the technology after all. It was 2024. We had everything at our fingertips, and these kinds of things were supposed to make our lives easier, right? I entered my home address into the app, secured the phone on the dashboard holder, and started driving. I remember the streetlights casting long shadows as I made my way down the familiar roads. Everything seemed normal. I passed the same fast food joint, the gas station, the little park where I used to walk my dog before he passed. It was all familiar, comforting even. As I drove, I glanced at the GPS every few minutes. I had made this trip countless times, and yet the app kept suggesting an alternate route. Odd, I thought. I had always taken the main highway, but tonight, the GPS was routing me through small side streets I didn't recognize. I thought maybe it was a quicker route, somehow avoiding traffic, but I wasn't sure. The first time I really paid attention to the route, I was already a good 15 minutes away from my usual path. I double-checked the app. Recalculating route, it said, and then suggested yet another detour. This time, it was directing me toward even more unfamiliar territory, an area I didn't recall ever driving through. By now, a sense of unease started to creep in. My gut was telling me something was off, but my logical side kept pushing the feeling aside. Maybe I was just tired from the long week. It was easy to chalk it up to that. I kept driving, following the app's instructions. As I ventured further into these unfamiliar streets, the houses became more sparse and the streetlights dimmer. I wasn't quite sure where I was, but the GPS seemed confident in its directions, and I didn't want to second guess it. The further I went, the more isolated the neighborhood appeared. The roads were narrower, winding through trees, and the occasional house loomed like shadows in the dark. Still, I pressed on. After all, I trusted the technology. It wasn't like I was lost. The GPS was still there, guiding me along. I passed a small sign, half hidden by overgrown bushes, indicating a town I didn't recognize. The name was unfamiliar, and the place looked far from any town I knew. It wasn't the sort of place you'd expect to see on a well-traveled route home. I thought it odd, but again, I kept going. Perhaps the app had rerouted me for a reason. Maybe there was an accident or a closed road up ahead. But there were no signs, no visible traffic, nothing to explain why I was being directed here. At this point, I was feeling a little more than just uneasy. There was something in the air, something that felt wrong, like a nagging feeling in the back of my mind, telling me that I shouldn't be here. I began to wonder how the app was so sure of these directions. Was this really a faster route, or was it leading me into unknown territory for a reason I didn't understand? I told myself I was overreacting. It was just a detour, just another technological glitch. But then, something happened that made me doubt my assumptions. The app suddenly went silent. No more instructions, no more recalculating. The screen, which had been constantly updating, froze. The only thing displayed was a map of the area, showing me a small red arrow pointing in a direction I hadn't expected. I tapped the screen a few times, thinking maybe the phone had just glitched, but it was no use. The app remained still. I wasn't entirely sure what to do next. It wasn't as if I could just stop and ask for directions. This was the middle of nowhere, and the only thing surrounding me was dark forest and the occasional flicker of an old, distant streetlight. Then, the road ahead of me seemed to disappear into nothing. A small, narrow path led through the trees, barely wide enough for my car to fit. At that point, I felt the first real pang of fear. My headlights barely illuminated the road ahead, and the unsettling quiet of the area was starting to get to me. I looked at the GPS one more time. The red arrow was still there, pointing ahead, urging me forward. And against all better judgment, I continued. The deeper I went, the more I felt that unsettling chill in the air. The trees seemed to press in closer, and the road twisted in ways that didn't feel natural. It was as if I was being led into a place that didn't belong on any map. I looked around, trying to find something familiar, but nothing stood out. The road didn't look like anything I had ever seen before, even though I was so sure I had been on this road countless times. Where had I gone wrong? Why did I feel so out of place? It was then that I realized this wasn't my route anymore. The path I was on felt wrong, like I was somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. But where could I go now? Would turning around even help? I wasn't sure how long I had been driving on that winding, narrow road, but as I continued to push forward, a cold sense of dread settled over me. The deeper I ventured, the more the feeling of isolation began to weigh on me. The trees that lined both sides of the road had now grown so thick that they blocked out most of the faint moonlight, leaving me in an eerie, perpetual twilight. My headlights barely cut through the oppressive darkness, casting long, distorted shadows on the road ahead. It was as if I was driving through some sort of forgotten place, untouched by time, untouched by anyone who had been there before. I glanced at the GPS again, hoping for some kind of reassurance, but all I saw was the red arrow pointing ever forward into the unknown. No new instructions, no new messages. Just that simple, unwavering arrow. My phone buzzed suddenly, one of those vibrations that feel too loud for their own good. It startled me, but when I checked the screen, I saw a message notification pop up. It wasn't anything important, just a text from a coworker, asking if I had finished some work I had been doing earlier in the week. But what stood out to me wasn't the content of the message. It was the time it had come through. It was 3:27 a.m. I couldn't recall the last time I'd looked at the clock, but I was certain it hadn't been that late when I first started my drive. I had left the office around 9:30, and the drive should have taken just under an hour, depending on traffic. And yet here I was, hours later, driving down what was essentially a ghost road. I shook off the thought, dismissing it as my mind playing tricks. After all, I had no idea where I was, so it was possible I had just lost track of time, right? I didn't want to get too wrapped up in it. That's when I noticed something strange, a noise. At first, I thought it might have been the car itself, some odd mechanical hum coming from under the hood. But no, this was different. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping sound, like something gently hitting the window. I glanced at the side mirrors, thinking perhaps I had driven too close to a tree or a bush, and something had brushed against the window. But when I turned my head, I saw nothing but darkness. No branches, no movement. Just the same thick forest surrounding me, as far as I could see. The sound continued. Tap, 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 tap. I pressed the brake slightly, slowing the car to a crawl, trying to focus on the noise. My heart began to race. I wanted to roll the window down and check, but the cold and the strange atmosphere around me made me hesitate. It was one of those moments when you know something's wrong, but you're unsure whether it's best to acknowledge it or just keep moving forward, hoping that whatever it is will go away. The tapping stopped for a moment, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. I had convinced myself it was nothing, just the wind or some random, natural occurrence. But then, just as quickly, the noise started again. Louder this time, almost as if it was coming from inside the car. My pulse quickened. I tried to focus, scanning the dashboard for any signs that something was malfunctioning. The GPS was still on, the little red arrow guiding me, but the tapping was relentless now, tapping on the window, tapping on the roof, like something or someone was trying to get in. I pulled over, my heart hammering in my chest. The car's engine idled softly as I sat there, trying to regain some semblance of calm. I reached for the door handle, but I hesitated again. Why was I so afraid? It was probably just a branch or something, right? I could roll the window down, have a quick look, and move on. But the thought of stepping out into that desolate stretch of road stopped me. The silence around me was deafening. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting. Even the tapping seemed to pause, as though it were watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. I looked through the rearview mirror, then at the side mirror, trying to catch a glimpse of anything out of the ordinary. Nothing. But still, that strange feeling remained, like I wasn't alone, like someone or something was out there, just beyond the reach of my headlights. And then the tapping began again, this time even louder than before. I jumped in my seat, the sound so close that it felt as though it was coming from inside the car itself. The air around me was thick with tension, the weight of the moment pressing down on me like a physical force. Suddenly, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out of there. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, the car lurching forward as I tried to put as much distance between myself and whatever was lurking in the dark. The road ahead twisted, and the trees seemed to close in even further, like they were pushing me into this unknown territory. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. I didn't dare look back. I was afraid that if I did, I might see something. I wasn't ready to see something that I couldn't explain, no matter how hard I tried. I kept driving, faster now, hoping that the GPS would finally lead me back to familiar ground. But the deeper I went, the more confused I became. The roads, which should have been leading me home, seemed to be taking me further away. The GPS was still directing me, but the route had become increasingly erratic. It was as if the app had lost track of where it was trying to take me. The screen flickered briefly before going completely black. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt as the darkness around me seemed to consume everything. What the hell was going on? The tap, tap, tap on the window continued, but this time, it wasn't just on the outside. It was coming from within, from all sides, as if I was surrounded by something I couldn't see. I stared into the blackness, trying to understand what was happening. The world outside the car seemed to fall away, and I felt more isolated than ever. The silence that followed my decision to floor the gas pedal felt almost unbearable, suffocating me as I sped down the road. The only sound was the engine roaring, but even that felt distant, swallowed by the vast, empty darkness surrounding me. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, and I could feel a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. The tapping had stopped, but the feeling of being watched of something just out of reach remained. It gnawed at my consciousness, making every second feel like an eternity. I glanced at the GPS screen again. The arrow still moved forward, but now it looked like I was heading deeper into a labyrinth of winding roads with no clear way out. I had lost track of time and direction. The more I drove, the more disoriented I became. I knew I needed to make sense of this, but I couldn't shake the overwhelming sensation that I was moving farther and farther from civilization. There were no streetlights, no signs, nothing to indicate where I was or where I was going. As I drove on, I noticed that the landscape outside the car had begun to change. The trees, which had initially been tightly packed along the road, now seemed to spread out in an unnatural way, casting long shadows that stretched and twisted in odd patterns. The ground was uneven, and it almost looked like the road itself was starting to deteriorate, cracked and uneven, like it hadn't been maintained in years. I could feel my pulse quicken again, but I told myself it was just a case of nerves. There had to be a logical explanation for everything. Maybe the GPS was malfunctioning, leading me down uncharted paths. Maybe I was just overthinking things. But there was a part of me, deep down, that knew something wasn't right. This didn't feel like a random glitch in the system. Suddenly, the lights of my car flickered, casting strange, momentary shadows across the road. My heart skipped a beat as I looked up, fully expecting to see anything that might explain the growing unease in my chest. But there was nothing. The road ahead was empty, the trees eerily still. The quiet had returned, but it wasn't the calm silence of a peaceful night. It was a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to press down on the car, filling the air with a sense of dread. The tapping started again, this time from the roof of the car. Tap, tap, tap. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. It was unmistakable this time. Something was up there, something that I couldn't see. I reached for the window control, but my hand trembled too much to get a firm grip on it. The tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent, like a warning. What was that? I quickly scanned my surroundings. No one was in sight. No other cars. No lights. Just the dark road, the dark trees, and the tapping that felt like it was coming from all directions at once. It was so loud, so constant that I couldn't tell where it was coming from anymore. It felt as if the car itself was being assaulted by invisible hands, pressing against the metal frame, trying to get in. I slammed my foot on the brake and pulled the car over, the tires screeching as I slid to the side of the road. My hands were shaking as I turned off the engine, the sudden silence inside the car almost deafening. I sat still for a moment, breathing heavily, trying to calm myself. There had to be a logical explanation for this, I told myself again. But the more I tried to reason with myself, the less I believed it. I got out of the car, heart hammering in my chest, the cold air hitting my face. The ground was damp beneath my shoes, and the smell of wet earth and moss filled the air. I looked up at the trees again, trying to figure out where the tapping had come from, but they were as still as ever. Nothing was out of place, and yet everything felt wrong. Then I heard it again. A low, scraping sound coming from the back of the car. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but there was nothing there. Just the dark emptiness, stretching out in every direction. I hesitated for a moment, then took a step toward the rear of the car, slowly, cautiously. I reached out to touch the trunk, expecting to feel the cool metal beneath my fingers. But as soon as my hand made contact, the sound stopped. It was as if whatever had been there had been waiting for me to acknowledge it. I quickly stepped back, feeling a surge of panic rise within me. My instincts screamed at me to get back in the car and drive away. But part of me, the part that couldn't let go of the need for answers, urged me to investigate further. What was going on? Why was the GPS taking me down these roads? Why had I heard that tapping? Why did it feel like I was being followed? I turned back toward the road and looked into the trees again. This time, there was a glimmer, a flash of something white, moving in the distance. It was barely noticeable, like the flicker of light from an old, dying lantern. But it was enough to make me take a step back. I couldn't explain it, but something inside me urged me to follow it, to see what it was. Against my better judgment, I started walking toward the trees, my heart pounding in my chest. The further I went, the colder the air became. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as the atmosphere shifted around me. It was as though the very air was thickening, suffocating me with an unnatural chill. The further I walked, the more the landscape seemed to change. The trees, which had once been tall and foreboding, now looked twisted, their branches bent in unnatural angles. The shadows beneath them seemed darker, deeper, and somehow hungry. I stopped, suddenly unsure of what I was doing. My mind raced, warning me to turn back, but my feet wouldn't stop moving. I had to know what that light was. I had to understand. As I stepped deeper into the forest, I began to hear soft murmurs in the air. They were faint at first, like whispers just on the edge of hearing. But the more I listened, the clearer they became, like voices calling out to me from all directions. I could hear the words now, though I couldn't make them out clearly. And then, in the distance, I saw it a small clearing, a dim, flickering light at its center. I froze. My heart stopped. There, in the middle of the clearing, was something I couldn't quite comprehend. It was a figure tall, thin, and shrouded in shadow. Its outline flickered like a mirage, distorting as though it were both real and not real at the same time. And in its hand, it held a lantern, the faint light casting eerie shadows across the ground. It wasn't until I took another step forward that I realized it wasn't the lantern flickering. It was the figure itself. And with that realization, the whispers grew louder. My legs felt like they were glued to the forest floor, as if the very ground had grown roots into my shoes, anchoring me in place. The figure in the clearing, no, it wasn't just a figure anymore. It had shape, form, presence. And as I stood there, unable to look away, I realized that it was looking right at me, its head slowly tilting to the side, as if studying me. The lantern in its hand flickered once more, casting jagged shadows that twisted around the trees like living things, reaching out toward me, pulling at my very soul. I should have turned around. I should have run. My instincts screamed at me to do something, anything. But I couldn't. Every inch of my being was frozen in terror. I was rooted to the spot, my breath shallow, my chest tight, my mind racing through 1,000 possibilities, none of which made sense. The whispers were louder now, clearer, more distinct, like voices creeping into my brain, clawing at my thoughts. I couldn't understand the words, but I felt their urgency, their demand. They were saying something I needed to hear. I strained to listen, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart, echoing in my ears. Then, the figure took a step forward. A slow, deliberate motion. The lantern flickered again, and this time, the shadows seemed to stretch out toward me, the air growing thick, suffocating. The chill was unbearable. It felt like the temperature had dropped by 10 degrees in an instant. I could see my breath forming in front of me like a cloud of smoke. My skin tingled with the cold, but it was nothing compared to the ice that had gripped my heart. The figure didn't speak. It didn't move any closer, but I could feel its presence growing stronger, pressing in on me like it was slowly suffocating me. And then, without warning, it lifted the lantern higher, and the light flooded the clearing, revealing the thing that had been hiding just beyond my sight. A face, or rather, something resembling a face. It was distorted, like a mask that had been stretched too tight, its features uneven and shifting. The eyes, if you could call them eyes, were dark pits of nothingness, blacker than the night around us. And its mouth, if that's what it was an open void, wide and jagged, as though it had been torn open by something far more sinister than natural means. The thing was made of shadows, of darkness itself, and it felt as if it was not of this world. It took another step forward. My body finally responded to the terror that gripped me, and I stumbled backward, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the car keys in my pocket. But as I reached for them, a cold wind swept through the clearing, and I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Not the sound of my own, but someone else's. Heavy, deliberate, almost too loud for the silence that had swallowed everything else. I turned my head, and my stomach dropped. The figure hadn't moved, but something else was now there, 2 more figures, standing just outside the reach of the lantern's light, their forms shifting in and out of focus, like they were being distorted by some invisible force. They were taller than the first, much taller, and their eyes, those horrible, black eyes, were fixed on me. I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat, my legs trembling beneath me. I was trapped. There was no way out. I was surrounded. Suddenly, I heard a voice, a harsh, guttural whisper that scraped at my mind like fingernails on a chalkboard. The words were clear now, and as they slipped into my thoughts, I understood them. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, the voice wrecked, as though it was barely able to hold on to its own existence. "This place. It's ours." The voice came from all around me. It wasn't just one of the figures speaking, it was as though they were all speaking at once, their voices intertwining in a cacophony of dread. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It was as if the very air around me had turned to poison, suffocating me with every breath I took. "Leave," the voice whispered again. "Or stay, and become one of us." I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, to escape, but my body refused to obey. My thoughts were no longer my own. I could hear the whispers now, louder, all-consuming, as they dug into my mind, twisting my thoughts until I couldn't tell what was real anymore. The world around me began to fade, replaced by an overwhelming sense of darkness that pressed in from all sides. The shadows, the figures, they were getting closer, their movements slow, deliberate. I could feel them closing in, their presence oppressive, suffocating. They weren't just standing there. They were getting closer, moving toward me like shadows come to life. Each step they took sent a chill crawling up my spine. Each movement made the ground beneath me feel less solid, less real. I tried to cry out, but my voice caught in my throat, trapped behind a barrier of fear. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My chest constricted as I tried to take in a breath, but all I could feel was the weight of their presence, their cold, endless gaze focused entirely on me. I felt them reach out, not physically, but mentally, like they were trying to latch onto my very thoughts. And for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something, some flicker of light in the distance. It was too far away to be real, but I clung to it. Desperation flooded through me as I grasped onto the thought of escape, of survival. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let them take me. I pushed myself forward, my legs finally responding, my heart hammering in my chest as I turned and ran back toward the road, back toward the safety of the car. But it was too late. The moment I turned, the whispers grew louder, and the shadows seemed to follow, closing in around me faster than I could comprehend. I reached the car and fumbled for the door, but my hands were slick with sweat, too shaky to hold onto the handle. The car door was locked, and I had to fumble with the keys in my pocket. My mind raced, my thoughts a blur of panic. I couldn't hear anything but the voices, the footsteps, the beating of my heart. Finally, the door opened, and I threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. I locked the doors, my breathing ragged, and for a moment, I thought I had escaped. But when I looked up, the windshield was covered in condensation, the surface fogging up like I was trapped inside a tomb. The figures weren't gone. They were standing outside the car, their faces mere inches from the glass. The darkness swirled around them, as if the shadows themselves were alive, stretching out toward me, trying to pull me into their realm. I couldn't escape. I was trapped. And in that moment, I understood. There was no escape. These creatures, these things, they were part of the road, part of the land, part of something ancient, something beyond human comprehension. And they had been waiting for someone like me, someone foolish enough to venture too far. As the last flicker of light from the lantern faded, I understood. I wasn't meant to leave. In the chaos, my hands shook uncontrollably as I finally managed to start the engine. The sound of the car's motor roared to life, but the feeling of the figures still outside the vehicle, their eyes locked on me, did not fade. I pressed the gas pedal, and the car shot forward, tires screeching against the gravel road. I didn't dare look back, my eyes fixed straight ahead, my heart pounding in my chest. The car jolted as it hit bumps and rocks along the path, but I couldn't focus on the road. My mind was consumed with the images of those creatures, their faces, the whispering voices that still echoed in my head. By the time I reached the main road, the figures were gone. The road was quiet again, eerily still. The night air was thick with tension, but I was far away from the clearing now. The weight pressing down on me lifted, but the fear stayed. I never spoke of what happened to anyone. I couldn't. I didn't want anyone to think I was crazy, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces. I could still hear the whispers. The images haunted me. The following days were filled with uncertainty. My friends and family noticed a change in me. I couldn't look at the woods the same way. Every dark corner of my life seemed filled with shadows now. I tried to rationalize it. I convinced myself that it was some sort of hallucination stress, lack of sleep, a trick of the mind. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen, and I knew the land we'd driven through was something that didn't belong to us. It was a place where ancient, unexplainable things lurked. No matter how far I ran, the whispers would follow. Months passed, but I never went back to that road. I never ventured near that place again. The memories lingered in the back of my mind, pulling at me when I least expected it. And while life went on, there were always reminders. The chill that swept over me whenever I passed a dark forest. The unease that settled in when a storm hit, like I was being watched. I realized, too late, that it wasn't just the place, it was the road itself. something that had existed long before I arrived. I was never meant to leave that night. And perhaps that was the biggest horror of all, that some roads were meant to be traveled, and some roads were meant to keep you. Sometimes I still hear the faint whispering carried by the wind.